Thank you for joining in today's Cryptid horror stories. The first story today is called The Azure Throat, and this is a horror story about the Lusca. And in this story, a group of 6 high-end, extreme tourism divers arrive at a remote, unnamed blue hole off Andros Island. They are led by a disgraced marine biologist obsessed with him of the hairy hands, and a cautious safety diver. The blue hole is a perfect, haunting circle of sapphire water that drops into a pitch-black limestone abyss. The second story today is called The Sulfur Sleep, and this is a horror story about the Popobawa, and in this story a coastal village on Pemba Island, a climate of collective insomnia. People are terrified to sleep. Those who do wake up with inexplicable bruises or a feeling of being watched. A skeptical local doctor who treats the Popobawa victims, people suffering from extreme psychological trauma and physical lacerations. He attributes it to mass hysteria until he finds a patient whose eyelids have been surgically removed while they slept. In the description below, the stories have been timestamped. Also, don't forget to hit the like and subscribe button so you don't miss the stories yet to come. Now for today's cryptid horror stories, I hope you all enjoy. The Azure Throat. Recovered audio log fragment 1, device unknown. The following audio was recovered from a waterproof recording device found floating in the waters off the southeastern coast of Andros Island, Bahamas. The device was a Garmin InReach Mini 2, registered to Mr. Gary Cordes, a former research associate at the University of Miami's Rosenstiel School of Marine and Atmospheric Science. The device's memory card was partially corrupted. What follows is a transcription of the salvageable audio, beginning at timestamp 00:14:22. Audio quality is poor. There is significant ambient noise, the hiss of compressed air, the rhythmic gurgle of a regulator, the deep, almost subsonic hum of water moving through an enclosed space. The voice is a whisper. Not the whisper of secrecy, but the whisper of a man whose body has been so thoroughly saturated with terror that his vocal cords have forgotten how to produce any other volume. It didn't eat the boat. Pause. 4 seconds of nothing but the sound of breathing, shallow, rapid, animal. It didn't eat the boat, it's using the boat as a lure. A sound, metal screeching against coral. The recording captures a high-frequency shriek that causes the microphone to clip. It is not a scream. It is geological. It is the sound of the earth itself being scraped. Then, silence. The audio file continues for another 7 minutes and 43 seconds, but captures only the sound of water and a single, faint heartbeat. End of fragment 1. The blue hole had no name. This was not unusual in the Bahamas. There were hundreds of blue holes scattered across the archipelago, many of them uncharted, others known only to local fishermen who gave them nicknames that never made it onto any official map. But this one, located on the southeastern coast of Andros Island, roughly 3 kilometers inland from the mouth of a tidal creek that the locals called Big Hinjaw Creek, was different. It had no nickname. It had no folklore attached to it. It was simply avoided. Gary Cordes had found it by accident, or so he told himself. In reality, he had been looking for it for 11 years, ever since he had stumbled across a reference in a forgotten 1974 issue of the Bahamian Field Naturalist, a defunct periodical that had published exactly 6 issues before its funding was pulled, to a perfectly circular sapphire vent on Andros that local bone fishermen refused to approach. The article, written by a marine hobbyist named Harold Quintero, described the hole in terms that were either poetic or unhinged, depending on your perspective. The water is the blue of a vein seen through skin, Quintero had written, and it drinks light the way a man drinks rum greedily and with a hunger that does not end. Quintero had attempted to dive the hole alone in 1972. He was never seen again. His equipment was found on the bank, folded neatly, as though he had simply stepped out of his own skin and walked away. Gary had read that sentence, folded neatly, and something in his brain had clicked. the way a key turns in a lock that has been waiting for decades. He had spent the next 11 years losing everything: his tenure at the university, his marriage, his credibility in the scientific community. He had spent 4 of those years writing a paper on Him of the Hairy Hands, a figure from Andros Island folklore that was described in colonial-era texts as a sea creature with enormous hairy arms that could pull a fishing boat beneath the water in the time it took a man to blink. The paper was rejected by every peer-reviewed journal he submitted it to. The reviews were not kind. One reviewer from marine biology had written, "Dr. Cordes has confused folklore with data. The Lusca is a myth, not a specimen. This paper is an embarrassment to the field." Gary had framed that review. It hung above the desk in his rented apartment in Nassau, where he lived on the proceeds of a small inheritance and the occasional consulting fee from dive companies who needed someone to tell them where not to send their tourists. He was 53 years old, sunburned, thin, and consumed by a certainty that had calcified into something harder than obsession. It had become religion. He did not merely believe in the Lusca. He knew it existed, the way a man knows his own heartbeat. He had seen the evidence, the sonar anomalies, the severed fishing lines that came up frayed as though they had been chewed, the photographs of suction cup scars on the hulls of boats that had passed over deep water and come back with marks that no barnacle or reef could explain. He had compiled a dossier of 47 unexplained diver disappearances in Bahamian blue holes over the past 4 decades. 47. The authorities called them drowning incidents. Gary called them what they were: feedings. The problem was that no one believed him. And the deeper problem, the one that gnawed at him at 3 in the morning when the rum was gone and the ceiling fan clicked rhythmically overhead, was that he could not prove it alone. He needed witnesses, he needed a team, and he needed money. The money came from an unlikely source: a Silicon Valley entrepreneur named Marcus Webb, who had made his fortune in artificial intelligence and had recently developed an obsession with extreme tourism, the practice of traveling to places that were actively trying to kill you. Webb had climbed K2 without oxygen, base jumped from the Burj Khalifa, and free-dived in the Great Blue Hole of Belize. He was 41, lean, sun-weathered, and possessed of the particular brand of arrogance that comes from having survived enough near-death experiences to believe you were unkillable. Webb had found Gary through a Reddit post, one of the few public statements Gary had made about the Lusca, buried in a thread about unexplained ocean phenomena. Webb had messaged him, "I'll fund the expedition. I'll bring the team. You bring the location and the expertise. I want to go where no one has gone before." Gary had hesitated. There was a reason no one had gone to this particular blue hole before, and it wasn't because of its remoteness. It was because the people who lived near it, the bonefishermen of South Andros, men who had spent their entire lives on the water and who could read a reef the way a blind man reads Braille, would not go near it. They would not speak its name. When Gary had asked one of them, an 80-year-old man named Tito Mortimer, about the hole, Tito had looked at him with an expression that Gary would never forget. It was not fear, exactly. It was the expression of a man who had seen something that had reordered his understanding of what was possible, and who had spent the rest of his life trying to forget it. "There is nothing there," Tito had said. "That's the point. You go there and there is nothing, not even you." Gary had gone anyway. He had flown to South Andros, hired a boat, and motored to the creek. He had found the blue hole exactly where Quintero's article had placed it, a perfect circle of sapphire water, roughly 60 meters in diameter, set into a landscape of low scrub and limestone karst. The water was so blue it looked artificial, like a pool of liquid sapphire that someone had poured into the rock. And it was still, unnaturally still. Even when the wind blew, and the wind always blew on Andros, always, the surface of the blue hole did not ripple. It sat there like an eye, staring upward at the sky, waiting. Gary had stood on the bank and felt the hair on his arms stand up, not from the wind, from something else. A vibration, barely perceptible, that came up through the soles of his boots and settled into his teeth. It was not mechanical. It was biological. It was the kind of vibration you feel when you stand too close to a sleeping animal, the sense of a vast, dormant system still operating at a frequency too low for conscious perception. He had not dived that day. He had turned around, gotten back in the boat, and returned to Nassau. And then he had called Marcus Webb and said, "I found it." The team assembled in Nassau over the course of a week in early March. There were 6 of them, not counting the boat captain and the surface support, who would remain on the vessel. Marcus Webb was the financier and the self-appointed leader, though his leadership was more nominal than actual. He was the kind of man who confused confidence for competence, and the line between the two, invisible on dry land, becomes lethal at depth. Robin Lim was the safety diver. She was 36, Korean-American, with a calm so deep it bordered on eerie. She had spent 10 years as a U.S. Navy dive instructor before going private, and she had the kind of resume that made insurance companies comfortable and dive buddies nervous. 37 rescue dives, 4 body recoveries, and a citation from the Navy for pulling 2 SEAL trainees out of a flooded cave in Coronado after their guide line snapped. She spoke rarely, and when she did, it was in short, declarative sentences that left no room for interpretation. "We turn at 50 meters. You check your gauge, not your buddies. If I say abort, you abort." She had been hired by Webb specifically because she had no fear, and Webb had mistaken that for recklessness. In fact, Robin's lack of fear was the product of a meticulous, almost mathematical relationship with risk. She did not fear things she could control, and she avoided things she could not. She had not yet decided which category the blue hole fell into. The third member of the team was Dr. Nadia Okonkwo, a marine geologist from Lagos who had been recruited for her expertise in limestone karst systems. Nadia was 29, brilliant, and in the middle of a nasty divorce that she compensated for by working obsessively. She had dived more blue holes than anyone else on the team, not for thrills, but for science, and she was the only one who seemed genuinely excited rather than nervous. "Blue holes are time capsules," she told Robin over dinner the night before they departed. "Everything that falls in stays. The water is anoxic below the halocline. Nothing decomposes. It's the closest thing we have to a geological museum." Robin had looked at her and said, "Museums don't eat people." Nadia had laughed. Robin hadn't. The fourth was Viktor Potinin, a Russian cave diver who held the record for the deepest cave penetration in the Voranya cave system. Viktor was 44, barrel-chested, taciturn, and missing the last 2 fingers of his left hand, lost to a frostbitten incident in the Urals that he refused to discuss. He communicated primarily through grunts and hand signals, and his diving was a thing of terrible beauty. He moved through water the way a shark does, with an economy of motion that suggested he had been born for no other environment. He had been hired because the blue hole was, at its core, a cave system, and there was no one alive better at navigating caves than Viktor Potinin. The fifth was Janelle Reyes, a freelance underwater photographer who had been embedded with the team to document the dive. Janelle was 27, Filipino-American, and had a portfolio that included shipwrecks, ice dives, and a harrowing series of photographs from inside a collapsed mine in West Virginia that had won a World Press Photo Award. She was not a scientist and not an extreme athlete. She was an artist who happened to work in the most dangerous medium on Earth. Her presence on the team was Webb's idea. "We need to document this for the documentary," he had said, and Robin had objected on safety grounds, arguing that a non-essential diver increased the risk profile of the entire operation. Webb had overruled her. Robin had noted this and noted it again, and would note it several more times before the dive was over. The sixth was Tomás Herrera, a Mexican freediving champion who had been brought on as what Webb called the secret weapon. Tomás could hold his breath for 7 minutes and 43 seconds, a personal record he had set in a pool in Chilum, and which he had never been able to replicate in open water. He was 25, wiry, perpetually smiling, and had the kind of natural water ability that made trained divers jealous and slightly resentful. He could swim down to 40 meters on a single breath and come back up looking like he'd gone for a stroll. Webb had brought him because, if we get into trouble, we need someone who can move without equipment. Robin had pointed out that a free diver at depth without a gas supply was a liability, not an asset. Webb had overruled her again. The team, plus a boat captain named Roy and a surface handler named Denise, departed Nassau at dawn on March 7th, aboard a 40-foot dive vessel called the Coral Penitent. The boat was overloaded with equipment: 24 scuba tanks, 2 rebreather units, a portable sonar array, 3 underwater scooters, DPVs, a medical kit the size of a suitcase, a set of high-pressure emergency oxygen canisters that Robin had insisted on, and enough food and water for 3 days. The plan was straightforward: dive the blue hole, document it, and return. The total dive time was estimated at 4 hours, with a maximum depth of 90 meters. They would descend as a group, tethered to a primary line, with Robin acting as the anchor at the halfway point and Victor taking the lead. Gary would navigate using a combination of the old Quintero article and his own sonar data, which he had gathered during 2 solo reconnaissance trips. But as the Coral Penitent threaded its way through the maze of tidal creeks and mangrove channels that led to the interior of South Andros, Gary stood at the bow and stared at the approaching tree line, and Robin, who had been watching him from the cockpit, came to stand beside him. "You're nervous," she said. It was not a question. "I'm cautious," Gary said. "What's the difference?" Gary turned to look at her. His eyes were the color of seawater, pale, shifting, and not entirely trustworthy. Nervous means you're afraid of what might happen. Cautious means you know what will happen and you're trying to be ready for it. Robin studied him for a moment. "And what will happen?" Gary looked back at the tree line. The mangroves were thinning, giving way to the low, scrubby limestone karst that characterized the interior of the island. The water beneath the hull was gin-clear, barely 3 feet deep, and the bottom was visible in perfect detail: turtle grass, brain coral, the occasional barracuda hanging motionless in the current. "We are going to find something that has been alive for longer than human civilization," Gary said, "and it is going to be unhappy to see us." Robin said nothing for a long time. Then, "If this is a joke, it's not funny." "It's not a joke." "Then what is it?" Gary pointed to the water ahead, where the mangrove channel opened into a shallow bay. "See that patch of water, the dark patch?" Robin looked. About 200 meters ahead, visible through the maze of green and brown, was a circle of water so blue it looked like a hole cut in the fabric of the world. Even from this distance, it was unmistakable. It didn't reflect the sky. It didn't shimmer. It simply sat there, impossibly blue, impossibly still, and impossibly deep. "That," Gary said, "is a throat, and we are about to climb down into it." They anchored the Coral Penitent 30 meters from the edge of the blue hole. The water here was shallow, barely 2 meters, and the bottom was visible: white sand, a few scattered coral heads, the skeletal remains of a mangrove that had been dead for decades. But the blue hole itself was a void. The sonar, when Roy ran it, showed a vertical shaft that dropped straight down to a depth of approximately 90 meters before the signal was lost, not because the hole ended, but because the sonar couldn't bounce back. The sound went in and didn't come out, like dropping a stone into a well so deep you never hear it hit bottom. Nadia examined the sonar readout with an expression that shifted from fascination to concern. "This doesn't make sense," she said. "The signal should reflect off the limestone walls, but it's just absorbing. The rock is absorbing the sonar." "Or something down there is absorbing it," Gary said. Nadia looked at him. "That's not how sonar works." "I know how sonar works. I also know what I've seen." "What have you seen?" Gary pulled a waterproof folder from his gear bag and opened it. Inside were photographs, grainy, water-damaged, some of them clearly taken with a disposable camera, of marks on the walls of blue holes. Long, parallel scratches in the limestone. Circular depressions that looked exactly like suction cup impressions, but scaled up by a factor of 10. And in one photograph taken in a blue hole on Great Exuma in 2019, what appeared to be a fragment of organic material, a strand of something dark, fibrous, and muscular, caught on a jagged piece of rock at a depth of 60 meters. Nadia studied the photographs. She said nothing for a long time. Then she put them down and said, "I'm going to need my own copy of these." "You can have the originals if we come back," Gary said. "If," Nadia said. Nobody said anything else for a while. The dive briefing was conducted on the aft deck of the Coral Penitent, with the blue hole visible 30 meters away, its sapphire surface so still it looked like a painted window. Robin stood at the front of the briefing, a laminated dive plan in her hand, and spoke in the flat, affectless tone of someone who has given 1,000 briefings and expects to give 1,000 more. "Primary line goes in at the center of the hole," she said. "Victor leads. Gary navigates. I anchor at the 45-meter mark. That's our turnaround point if anything goes wrong. Nadia and Victor continue to 90 meters. Webb, Reyes, and Herrera stay above the 60-meter line. Nobody goes below 90. Nobody goes solo. We dive in pairs, and if your partner is more than 3 meters away from you at any time, you abort and ascend. Is that understood?" Webb raised his hand. "What if we find something worth going deeper for?" "Then we come back with better equipment and more gas. Nobody goes below 90 meters on this dive. Period." Webb smiled the smile of a man who had never been told no by anything he couldn't outrun. "Understood," he said. Robin looked at him for a beat longer than necessary. Then she looked at the rest of the team. "We have enough gas for 4 hours of bottom time. We have a decompression schedule that requires staged ascents at 21, 15, and 6 meters. Total dive time, including deco, is approximately 5.5 hours. We will be in the water before 1000 hours and back on the boat by 1600. Any questions?" Victor, who had been cleaning his regulator with the focus of a surgeon, looked up and said, in his thick Russian accent, "What do we do if we find the creature?" The deck went quiet. The only sound was the wind and the distant call of a frigate bird. Robin said, "We don't find the creature. We find a cave, we take pictures, we collect samples, and we leave. If we encounter any marine life that presents a threat, we abort and ascend. Immediately. No heroics." Victor nodded. "And if the creature finds us?" Robin held his gaze. "Then we do exactly what I just said. We abort and ascend. The water in this hole is anoxic below the halocline. Anything living down there has adapted to a low-oxygen environment. We have not. We are visitors and we are on a timer. Every minute we spend below 45 meters is a minute of decompression obligation we have to pay back on the way up. We do not chase. We do not explore. We document and we leave. Are we clear?" Everyone nodded, even Webb. "Then gear up," Robin said. "We're in the water in 20 minutes. The blue hole was cold. This was the first thing Robin noticed. Not the color, not the depth, not the stillness, but the temperature. The surface water in the tidal creek had been a balmy 28 degrees Celsius, typical for Bahamian shallows in March. But the moment she dropped below the lip of the blue hole, the temperature plummeted. By the time she reached 5 meters, the water was 18 degrees. By 10 meters, it was 14. By 15, it was 9 degrees, cold enough to make her skin tighten and her teeth ache. The second thing she noticed was the light. It didn't diminish. It changed color. Above the lip of the hole, the water was the pale turquoise of a tropical reef. Below the lip, it deepened through a spectrum of blue that was almost musical in its progression, cerulean, cobalt, sapphire, indigo, until, at 30 meters, it became a color she had never seen before. It was a blue so dark it was almost black, but it was not black. It was a blue that contained light, the way an ember contains fire dormant, compressed, waiting. The walls of the hole were limestone, pale, striated, pocked with the fossil impressions of creatures that had died millions of years ago. The rock was smooth in some places, jagged in others, and everywhere it was marked with the evidence of water, scalloped erosion patterns, dissolution channels, the finger-like rills of 10,000 years of acid eating away at calcite. It was beautiful in the way that a razor is beautiful, precise, clean, and designed to cut. Victor descended first, his powerful kick carrying him down the primary line with a speed that would have been alarming if it weren't so controlled. He moved like a man who had spent more of his life underwater than above it, and his body, thick, muscular, efficient, was perfectly suited to the environment. He reached the 30-meter mark in under 2 minutes and paused, sweeping his light across the walls, cataloging the geography. Gary followed, then Nadia, then Webb, then Janelle with her camera housing, then Tamaz, who was diving on a single tank, a concession to his free-diving instincts that Robin had reluctantly approved. Robin went last, dropping down the line with her hand on the tether and her eyes on the team above her. At 30 meters, the hole began to narrow. This was expected. Blue holes, by their nature, are hourglass-shaped, a wide opening that constricts before opening into a larger cavern system below. The constriction, what cave divers call the throat, is typically the most dangerous part of the dive because it funnels water, increases current, and reduces maneuverability. Robin had briefed the team on this. She had told them to expect a constriction at approximately 35 meters based on the sonar data. But the sonar data was wrong. The throat began at 30 meters, not 35, and it didn't narrow gradually. It constricted sharply, the walls closing in from a comfortable 6-meter diameter to a claustrophobic 2 meters in the space of a single breath. Robin felt the walls on either side of her, close enough to touch, close enough to feel the cold radiating off the limestone, and a spike of adrenaline hit her system that she had not felt since her first cave dive in Coronado. She looked up. The team was strung out along the line above her, their lights casting dancing shadows on the narrowing walls. Victor was already through the constriction, his light visible below as a pale yellow glow. Nadia was entering it, her body horizontal, her fins close together to minimize her profile. Webb was waiting above the constriction, and for the first time, Robin saw something on his face that looked less like confidence and more like calculation. "Watch your spacing," Robin said into her comms unit. The underwater communication system was a short-range acoustic device, essentially a waterproof speaker that transmitted voice through the water as compressed sound waves. It was tinny, distorted, and prone to interference, but it worked. "Single file through the throat. Don't rush. Let the person ahead of you clear before you enter." One by one, they went through. The throat was roughly 4 meters long, a geological accident, a place where the limestone had collapsed inward millions of years ago and left a narrow, tube-like passage that connected the upper chamber of the blue hole to the deeper system below. The walls were slick with a bacterial film, a white, almost translucent slime that Nadia would later identify as a sulfur-eating bacterium, the kind that thrives in anoxic environments. It smelled, even through the regulator, of rotten eggs. Robin entered the throat last. The passage was tight. She could feel the rock on both shoulders, and her tank scraped against the ceiling with a sound that made her jaw clench. She controlled her breathing, kept her movements slow, and focused on the light ahead, Victor's light, steady and yellow, bobbing gently below. She emerged from the throat into a space that stole her breath. Below the constriction, the blue hole opened up. Not gradually, not gracefully, but suddenly, violently, as though the earth had simply decided to stop existing below this point. Robin's light, which had been bouncing off limestone walls moments ago, now shot out into a darkness so vast it swallowed the beam entirely. She could see nothing below her, nothing above her, nothing to either side. She was suspended in a void of cold, dark, utterly still water that extended in every direction farther than her light could reach. She checked her depth gauge. 42 meters. She checked her gas pressure, 210 bar. She checked her partner, Gary, who was hovering 3 meters to her left, his eyes wide, his light pointing down into the abyss below. "Robin," Gary's voice crackled through the comms. "Are you seeing this?" "Yes," Robin said. The sonar said 90 meters to the bottom. "Yes." "Look at your depth gauge." Robin looked, 42 meters. She looked down, nothing. "Gary, what are you saying?" "I'm saying that the sonar didn't fail. The sonar was correct, the bottom is at 90 meters, but the space below us isn't a shaft. It's a cavern, a massive cavern. The sonar hit the nearest wall, not the bottom. We are inside something. Enormous." Robin swept her light in a slow arc. The beam traveled outward and was absorbed by the darkness. She swept it again, wider. Nothing. No walls, no floor, no ceiling. Just water, black, cold, and utterly still, extending in every direction like the interior of a planet that had never learned to be empty. "Team," Robin said into the comms, and her voice was steady because her voice was always steady, but inside her chest, something cold and very old was beginning to uncurl. "Hold position. Nobody moves until we establish visual contact with the walls." The cavern below the throat was, by Nadia's estimation, approximately 200 meters in diameter and at least 150 meters deep. This made it, by a significant margin, the largest underwater cavern system ever discovered in a Bahamian blue hole, larger than the system beneath Daniel's blue hole on Great Exuma, larger than the wells of Waddling's blue hole on San Salvador, larger than anything in the published literature. "This is unprecedented," Nadia said into her comms, and her voice had the breathless quality of someone who has just discovered a new moon. "The volume of water in this chamber alone, it has to be millions of liters, and it's anoxic below 50 meters, totally anoxic. There's no oxygen. Nothing should be living down here." They descended as a group, keeping the primary line taut between them. Victor led, his light sweeping the darkness in methodical arcs. Nadia followed, taking compass bearings and sketching the cavern's approximate dimensions on a waterproof slate. Gary hovered near the center of the group, his eyes fixed on the darkness below with an intensity that Robin found unsettling. Webb, Janelle, and Tamaz stayed above the 60-meter line, their lights visible above as faint yellow glows, like satellites orbiting a dark star. At 60 meters, the water changed. The temperature, which had been holding steady at 9 degrees, dropped to 5. The bacterial film on the walls thickened, coating the limestone in a white, gelatinous layer that pulsed faintly in the light, not with bioluminescence, but with something else. Movement. The film was alive, and it was moving in slow, rhythmic waves that suggested respiration. "It's breathing," Nadia said. "It's a bacterial mat," Robin said. "They respond to water currents, it's not breathing." "Robin, there are no currents down here. The water is perfectly still. I've been monitoring the flow meter since we entered the chamber. 0 current, 0 flow, and that mat is moving." Robin looked at the mat. Nadia was right. The white film on the walls was rippling slowly, gently, in a pattern that was unmistakably rhythmic. In, out, like lungs, like gills, like something vast and alive breathing through the walls of the cavern itself. "That's not bacteria," Gary said quietly. "That's its skin." Nobody asked what he meant. They all knew. At 70 meters, they found the first anomaly. Victor's light, sweeping the eastern wall of the cavern, illuminated something that didn't belong. A shape, angular, geometric, unmistakably artificial, protruding from the bacterial mat like a bone from a wound. Victor moved toward it, and the shape resolved into something that made everyone on the team go silent. It was a boat. A small boat, perhaps 20 feet long, fiberglass hull, with the faded remains of a white and orange paint job that might have been cheerful in the 1970s. It was wedged into the wall of the cavern at a 30-degree angle, its bow pointing upward, its stern buried in the limestone. The hull was intact. The windshield was unbroken. The outboard motor, an old Evinrude, the kind that hadn't been manufactured in decades, was still attached. On the bow, in faded letters that were barely legible beneath the bacterial film, was a name, the Sally D. "Jesus," Webb said over the comms, "is that a boat?" "It's a boat," Victor confirmed. "How the hell did a boat get down here?" Nobody answered, because nobody could answer. The boat was 70 meters below the surface, inside a cavern that could only be accessed through a narrow throat that was barely wide enough for a single diver. There was no way a 20-foot vessel could have passed through that opening. There was no way it could have been lowered through the blue hole from above. The lip of the hole was barely wide enough for a person to enter with a tank on their back. "It must have been here before the throat collapsed," Nadia said. "If the throat is a geological collapse, a natural constriction that formed over time, then the boat could have entered the cavern when the opening was wider. Thousands of years ago." "Thousands of years," Webb said. "That boat isn't thousands of years old. Look at the motor. That's a 1970s Evinrude." Nadia paused. She swept her light over the hull again. Webb was right. The boat was not ancient. It was modern. It was here. "Gary," Robin said, "you said there was a diver named Harold Quintero who disappeared in this hole in 1972. Gary's voice was barely a whisper. "Quintero didn't have a boat. He dove alone." "Then whose boat is this?" Gary didn't answer. He was staring at the hull, and Robin followed his gaze to the bottom of the vessel, where the fiberglass met the limestone wall. There, in the gap between the boat and the rock, something was moving. Something dark, thick, and muscular, threaded through the gap like a vine growing through a fence. It was attached to the wall and attached to the boat, and it was not rock. It was not coral. It was not bacteria. It was organic. "Don't touch it," Robin said. Too late. Victor, who had been examining the boat's hull, reached out to brush away the bacterial film from the nameplate, and his hand brushed against one of the dark strands. The strand contracted, not slowly, violently, like a reflex, like a muscle pulling away from a flame. And then from the wall behind the boat, a sound. Low, resonant, and so deep it was felt rather than heard. A vibration that passed through the water and into their bodies, settling into their bones like a bass note played on an organ the size of a cathedral. "Back away from the boat," Robin said. "Everyone now." Victor pulled his hand back, but the sound didn't stop. It grew, slowly, steadily, the way a train grows in the distance, until the water around them was trembling with it, and the bacterial mat on the walls was rippling violently, and the primary line was vibrating like a guitar string. "Move," Robin said. "Up now, everyone." They turned and began to ascend. And as they did, from the darkness below the boat, from the void that they had not yet reached, from the very bottom of the cavern that the sonar could not map and the light could not penetrate, something answered. It was not a sound. It was a presence, a displacement of water felt in the chest before it was heard in the ears, that told every diver in that chamber, in the language of physics and fluid dynamics that needs no translation, that something very large had just moved in the dark below them. Something very large and very aware. And then from the dark, the first tentacle rose. The tentacle rose like a pillar. It did not emerge from the darkness the way a creature emerges from shadow, cautiously, gradually, its form resolving detail by detail. It simply appeared, as though the darkness itself had condensed into matter. One moment, the void below them was empty. The next, a column of dark, muscular tissue the diameter of a 50-gallon drum occupied the space where nothing had been, rising from the unseen floor of the cavern with a speed that should have been impossible in a fluid environment. Robin saw it first. Her light, pointed downward as she began her ascent, caught the leading edge of the thing as it swept upward through the water column. It was mottled dark brown and mottled gray, the color of a smoker's lung, and its surface was covered in suction cups the size of dinner plates, each one ringed with a pale, chitinous rim that gleamed in the beam of her light like a row of teeth. "DOWN," Robin screamed into her comms, and the word was barely out of her mouth before the tentacle swept through the space where Victor had been a moment before. Victor, who had been the last to turn away from the boat, felt the rush of water as the thing passed, a pressure wave that hit him from behind and sent him tumbling through the water like a leaf in a gale. He grabbed the primary line, caught himself, and looked down. The tentacle was rising. It had not retreated after its initial sweep. Instead, it was extending, elongating, reaching upward through the water column with a slow, deliberate grace that was more horrifying than speed. It was feeling. It was searching. The suction cups along its length were opening and closing rhythmically, each one a mouth, each one tasting the water for the chemical signature of prey. "Up," Robin shouted. "Everyone up the line now." The team scrambled. Nadia, who had been closest to the boat, kicked hard for the primary line and caught it with both hands, her fins churning the water as she hauled herself upward. Webb, hovering at 60 meters, looked down and saw the tentacle rising toward him and went rigid, not with fear, but with the paralysis of a man whose body has been presented with a stimulus so far outside its evolutionary experience that it has no protocol for response. "Webb, move," Robin barked. Webb moved. He grabbed the line and pulled himself upward with a ferocity that stripped the skin from his palms. Janelle, above him, had her camera raised and was shooting, motor drive clicking in the housing, strobe flashing, and Robin wanted to scream at her to drop the camera and climb. But there was no time because the tentacle was still rising, and it was not alone. From the darkness below, a second tentacle appeared, then a third, then a fourth. They rose in a ring, spaced evenly around the perimeter of the cavern, like the legs of a spider emerging from its burrow. Each one was as thick as a man's torso, and each one was covered in the same dinner plate suction cups, and each one was reaching upward with the same slow, patient, searching grace. They were forming a cage. "Robin," Gary's voice crackled through the comms. He was calm. That was the terrifying thing about Gary in the face of a creature from the deep that was currently reaching for him with tentacles the size of tree trunks. He was calm. "It's not attacking. It's enclosing. It's using the bottleneck, the throat, as a trap. We entered through the only exit, and now it's sealing the exit." Robin looked up. The throat, the narrow constriction at 30 meters, was directly above them. It was their only way out, and the tentacles, rising in their slow ring, were converging on it. If the tentacles reached the throat before they did, they would be sealed in. "Everyone to the line," Robin commanded. "Victor, you lead. Get to the throat. Nadia behind Victor. Webb, Reyes, Herrera, you're above us. You should be near the throat already. Get through it. Now." "I'm at the throat," Victor's voice came back. "It's clear. The constriction is open. Go through, don't wait for us." "I wait," Victor said. "Victor, Gio. I wait for the team." Robin wanted to argue, but there was no time. She could feel the water moving around her, not current, but displacement. The tentacles were still rising, and their motion was generating a slow, massive circulation in the cavern, a vortex that was pulling water, and everything in it, downward toward the center. The tentacles were not just sealing the exit. They were creating a drain. "Gary," Robin said, "how deep does this thing go?" "The sonar couldn't find the bottom." "That means it's deeper than 90 meters. "Much deeper. Robin, this hole doesn't go to 90 meters. It goes to the mantle." "That's not possible." "Neither is what we're looking at." They ascended in a ragged line, hauling themselves up the primary tether with a desperation that abandoned all pretense of technique. Victor reached the throat first and went through, his body folding sideways to fit through the narrow gap. Nadia followed, her slate clattering against the rock. Webb went next, then Janelle, who was still filming, the strobe flashing madly, and Robin would later want to strangle her for it, but would also be grateful because those frames would be the only visual evidence of what happened next. Robin entered the throat third from last, with Gary behind her and Tamaz at the rear. The constriction was tight, tighter than it had been on the way down, or so it felt, though Robin knew that was the adrenaline compressing her perception. The walls pressed in on her from both sides, the bacterial mat slick against her shoulders, and the ceiling scraped against her tank with a sound like fingernails on slate. She was halfway through when the tentacle hit. It came from behind, from below, from the cavern, and it hit the throat passage like a battering ram. Not the leading edge of a searching limb, but the full mass of a tentacle brought down with deliberate, crushing force against the narrowest point of the constriction. The rock shuddered. Robin felt it in her teeth, in her spine, in the fillings of her molars. The primary line snapped taut and then went slack, and for one hideous moment Robin was floating free in the throat passage with no line and no orientation, and the walls closing in and the water churning around her. "Line," she shouted. "Someone give me a line." A hand grabbed her wrist. Victor's hand, thick, calloused, missing 2 fingers, clamped onto her with a grip that could have bent steel. He hauled her through the throat passage and out the other side, into the upper chamber of the blue hole, and she tumbled into open water, gasping, her regulator clamped between her teeth. "Tamaz," she gasped. "Gary, where are they?" "Behind you," Gary's voice came through the comms. He was in the throat passage, and she could hear the strain in his voice, not from exertion, but from the sound that was coming through the rock. A grinding, a scraping, the sound of something impossibly large trying to force itself through a space that was impossibly small. "Tamaz," Robin said. "Nothing." Tamaz responded. Nothing. The comms were silent. Robin looked down into the throat passage and saw the darkness below, a darkness that was moving, that was churning, that was alive with the motion of something that was not rock and not water and not human. "Tamaz," Robin shouted. A hand appeared at the lower edge of the throat. Tamaz's hand, brown, slender, the hand of a free diver who had spent his life in the water. It was reaching upward, fingers splayed, grasping for the lip of the constriction. Robin dove for it. She hit the water head first, reaching, her hand stretching toward Tamaz's fingers. She caught them, caught 2 fingers, just 2, the ring and pinky, and pulled. The hand came free. Not Tamaz, the hand, just the hand. 2 fingers and a palm and a severed wrist, clean cut, the bone visible at the cross-section, white against the red of the muscle. The cut was not ragged, it was not a tear, it was a circle, a perfect circle, the diameter of a suction cup. Robin screamed. The hand floated in front of her, suspended in the beam of her light, and the fingers curled once. A spasm, a reflex, the last signal of a severed nerve, and then went still. Below in the throat something moved, something large and dark, filling the constriction, blocking the light from the cavern below. A shape that was not a tentacle but a head, massive, armored, with eyes that reflected Robin's dive light back at her from the depths of the passage like 2 coins at the bottom of a well. The creature was looking at her through the throat. Not seeing her, looking at her. Robin let go of the hand. It drifted downward slowly into the darkness of the throat and was swallowed. "Up," Robin said. Her voice was a thread. "Everyone up now." They ascended in a state of controlled panic, the worst kind, because the control is a thin shell over a howling void, and any crack in the shell releases the void. Robin set the pace, slow enough to avoid decompression sickness, fast enough to outrun the thing below. Every meter of ascent was a victory measured in pressure and pain. Behind them, the blue hole was alive. The water in the upper chamber had begun to circulate, a slow, clockwise rotation that was pulling them inward toward the center, toward the throat. Robin could feel it in her fins, in her body, in the subtle tug of the water against her skin. The creature below was generating current. It was pulling the entire volume of the upper chamber down through the throat, like a drain in a bathtub. Stay on the wall, Robin said. Hug the wall, use the rock for leverage. They did. Victor led, his powerful hands gripping the limestone and pulling himself upward against the current. Nadia followed, then Webb, then Janelle. Gary was behind Robin and he was not looking up. He was looking down. Gary, Robin said, eyes up, climb. It's coming, Gary said. I can feel it. I know, climb. Robin, do you understand what this thing is? It's not an octopus, it's not a squid, it's not a kraken, it's a Lusca. It's the apex predator of the blue hole ecosystem. It has been here for millennia, maybe longer. It uses the blue hole as a throat. It uses the geography as a weapon. The throat, the constriction, the bottleneck, that's not geology. That's its hunting strategy. The blue hole is shaped the way it is because the creature made it that way. Gary, I don't care, climb. Robin, listen to me. If it comes through the throat, we are dead, all of us. The throat is the only exit and it controls the throat. It's a funnel. We are inside a funnel. Climb the line. They climbed. The current was strengthening. Robin's fins churned against the pull and her gas consumption was climbing. She checked her gauge and saw that she was already at a rate that would empty her tank in 20 minutes. They had been down for 40 minutes. They had been breathing hard. The math was not good. At 20 meters, they hit the decompression zone. Stop, Robin said. Everyone stop. We have a deco obligation. Nobody wanted to stop. Every fiber of every body in that water column was screaming to go up, to break the surface, to get out. But Robin was the safety diver, and Robin's word was law, and they stopped. They held at 21 meters. The water here was warmer, 15 degrees, and the light from above was visible, a pale blue glow that promised air and sun and survival. But below them, the darkness was rising. The current was strengthening. And the sound, that deep, subsonic hum that they had first felt in the cavern, was growing. It was not a sound that the ears could process. It was a sound that the body processed, a vibration that settled into the organs and the bones and told the lizard brain, the part that had been alive for 300 million years, to run. Deco time, Robin said. She checked her computer. 3 minutes at 21 meters, then we go to 15, then 6, then surface. 3 minutes, Webb repeated. His voice was tight. We don't have 3 minutes. We have 3 minutes, Robin said. Because if we surface without deco, we get bent, and a case of decompression sickness in the middle of nowhere is a death sentence. So we do the time. Below them, a tentacle appeared at the lower edge of the upper chamber. It rose slowly, almost lazily, from the darkness of the throat and into the light. It was bigger than the others, as thick as a man's waist, and its suction cups, Robin could see now, were not smooth. They were ringed with teeth. Chitinous, curved, serrated teeth, the kind that could grip and hold and never let go. Robin, Gary said. I see it. It's testing the space. It's seeing if it can fit through the throat. I see it, Gary. Can it fit? Robin watched the tentacle. It extended upward, feeling the walls of the upper chamber, tracing the contours of the limestone, measuring. It was mapping the space. It was determining whether the upper chamber was large enough to accommodate its body. 3 minutes, Robin said. 2:45, 2:30. The tentacle withdrew, slid back down into the throat, back into the darkness. Robin allowed herself a breath. Then 2 more tentacles appeared on opposite sides of the chamber, rising in tandem. They were not testing. They were reaching. 1:45, Robin said. 1:30. One of the tentacles brushed Janelle's fin. Janelle screamed. The sound, transmitted through the water and the comms unit, was a shriek that distorted the speaker and sent a burst of static through everyone's earpiece. She kicked, hard, reflexive, the kick of a human body responding to a predator's touch, and her fin came loose from the tentacle, but the suction cups had left marks. Red circles on the black neoprene of her fin, perfectly spaced, each one the diameter of a quarter. 1 minute, Robin said. 1 minute and we go to 15. The tentacles were everywhere now. 4, 5, 6. She couldn't count them all rising from the throat in a ring, their tips reaching upward toward the divers suspended at the decompression stop. They were not fast. They didn't need to be fast. They were everywhere, and the divers were stationary, and the water was cold, and the gas was running out. 45 seconds. A tentacle wrapped around the primary line. Robin watched it happen, watched the dark, muscular arm coil around the line like a vine around a stake, and felt the line go taut beneath her hand. Then it snapped. The line, rated for 500 pounds of load, snapped like a thread, and the broken end recoiled upward past Robin's face, whipping through the water. The tentacle followed the broken line upward. It rose past Robin, past Gary, past Victor, and it reached the surface of the blue hole. Robin could see it, the tentacle breaking the plane of the water above, silhouetted against the light, and then it withdrew. Slowly, deliberately, back into the dark. "Go," Robin said. 15 meters now. They dropped to 15 meters. The tentacles followed, not chasing, accompanying. The creature was not trying to catch them. It was watching them ascend, the way a spider watches a fly struggle in a web. It was letting them climb, letting them think they were escaping. Because the exit was the trap. At 15 meters, Robin realized what Gary had been trying to tell her. The blue hole was not a cave. It was not a geological formation. It was a mouth. The throat was the gullet, the cavern was the stomach, and the divers were the meal. The creature didn't hunt by chasing. It hunted by waiting. It sat at the bottom of the hole in the dark, and it waited for things to fall in. And when they did, it rose slowly, patiently, and it sealed the exit, and then it fed. The boat, the Sally D, was not a wreck. It was not debris. It was a lure. The creature had taken a boat, a whole boat, a 20-foot vessel, and dragged it down through the blue hole and wedged it into the wall of the cavern as a piece of bait. Because divers, when they see a wreck, go to it. They investigate. They swim close. And when they are close, when they are inside the kill radius, the creature takes them. "It didn't eat the boat," Robin whispered. "It's using the boat as a lure." She didn't realize she had spoken aloud until Gary replied, his voice barely audible. "Now you understand." 2 minutes at 15, Robin said. Her voice was mechanical. The safety diver in her had taken over, the part that counted seconds and checked gauges and managed the math of survival, because the rest of her, the human part, had shut down. Then 6 meters. Then surface. "What about Tomas?" Webb said. His voice had changed. The confidence was gone. What remained was the voice of a man who has realized, for the first time in his life, that there are things in the world that money cannot buy and charm cannot deflect and arrogance cannot survive. "Tomas is gone," Robin said. "Gone how?" "Below in the throat, it took him. Like ate him." "I don't know, Webb. I know it took his hand. I know he's not on the comms. I know he's not on the line. He's gone." Silence, the sound of breathing, the sound of the water churning below them. "How many of us are left?" Nadia asked. Robin counted. Victor, Nadia, Webb, Janelle, Gary, Robin, 6. They had entered the water as 6 divers. One was gone. They were 5. No, wait. Robin had counted wrong. She counted again. Victor, Nadia, Webb, Janelle, Gary, herself. That was 6. But Tomas had been the 6th. No, the 7th. No, there had been 6 divers plus the surface team. 6 divers: Webb, Robin, Nadia, Victor, Janelle, Tomas. Wait, was it 6 or 7? She had said 6 at the briefing. She had been clear, 6 divers. But she counted 6 now, and Tomas was gone, which meant there should be 5. "Who's missing?" Robin said. "Sound off names now." "Victor, Nadia, Webb, Janelle, Gary." That was 5. Robin was the 6th, 6 total. Tomas made 7, but there were only supposed to be 6 divers. Robin's mind was unraveling. She gripped the rock wall and forced herself to think. "Webb," she said, "how many divers did you hire?" "What? How many divers did you hire?" Seven divers. I hired 7. Wait, no, 6. I told you 6. You told me 6, but we have 7 in the water." "No, we had 6 plus you. You were the safety diver, 7 total." Robin closed her eyes. She had been the safety diver, the 7th. There were 7 of them in the water. Tamaz was gone. 6 remained. "Okay," she said. "Okay, 6 of us. We're 6. Go to 6 meters. Deco stop 3 minutes." They dropped to 6 meters. The light here was strong. They could see the surface above them, shimmering, alive, 10 meters away. 10 meters. The length of a swimming pool. The distance between them and air. Below, the tentacles waited. The 3 minutes at 6 meters were the longest 3 minutes of Robin's life. She counted the seconds on her computer, watching the digital display tick down with a fixation that bordered on pathological. Behind her, the water was moving. Not the slow, patient circulation of the creature's tentacles, but something faster, something agitated. At the 90-second mark, Janelle screamed. Robin spun. Janelle was 6 meters away, her body convulsing, her regulator pulled from her mouth by a force that was not her own hands. Her light was pointing downward, and in its beam, Robin saw the tentacle wrapped around Janelle's ankle, coiling upward around her calf, her knee, her thigh, pulling her down. Janelle's eyes were wide. Her mouth was open. Bubbles poured from her lips in a frantic, silent scream. Her hands clawed at the tentacle, her fingers scraping against the chitinous suction cups, and the cups gripped back, each one a mouth, each one tasting her neoprene, her skin, her flesh. Robin moved. She didn't think she moved. She rocketed toward Janelle, her fins driving through the water, her hand reaching for the tentacle that was pulling her teammate into the dark. She caught Janelle's hand, held it, pulled. The tentacle pulled harder. Robin felt her shoulder dislocate. The pain was a white flash, a detonation in her joint that sent her vision spiraling into static. But she didn't let go. She held Janelle's hand with a grip that was beyond strength. It was will, pure and animal, the will of a creature that has decided it will not lose another one. "Victor," she screamed. "Victor, help." Victor was there. He appeared beside her like a shadow, his dive knife in his hand, a short, serrated blade, laughably inadequate, the kind of tool you use to cut fishing line, not sever the tentacle of a creature that could crush a boat. But Victor didn't hesitate. He drove the knife into the tentacle. The blade sank in. The tissue parted barely, grudgingly, the muscle fiber resisting the steel, and a fluid gushed from the wound. Not blood, not red, dark, almost black. The color of octopus ink, but thicker, denser, and it poured from the cut in a stream that clouded the water and blotted out the light. The tentacle convulsed. It released Janelle's leg, not because of the pain, Robin would realize later, but because the creature was reacting to the injury the way a human reacts to a stubbed toe. Reflexively, momentarily, a flinch of the larger organism. The tentacle whipped downward, away from the knife, and in the moment of release, Robin and Victor pulled Janelle upward. But Janelle was not breathing. Her regulator was gone. Her eyes were open, rolled back, the whites showing. Her chest was still. Robin grabbed her, pinched her nose, sealed her mouth over Janelle's, and breathed 2 rescue breaths, forcing air into Janelle's lungs, feeling the chest rise and fall. Bubbles leaked from Janelle's nose. Her eyes didn't move. "Surface," Robin said. "We surface now, Deco be damned." They went up, all of them. 6 meters to the surface in 12 seconds, a speed that would, under normal circumstances, guarantee decompression sickness. But these were not normal circumstances, and the water below them was boiling with tentacles, and the creature was rising. They could feel it, the displacement, the pressure wave, the sense of something vast ascending from the deep like a nightmare surfacing from the subconscious. Robin broke the surface with Janelle in her arms. "Boat," she screamed. "Roy D and ISC, get her." The coral penitent was 30 meters away. Roy saw them, saw Robin's face, wild and white, saw Janelle's limp body, and gunned the engine. The boat surged toward them. Behind Robin, the surface of the blue hole began to move. It started as a dimple, a depression in the surface of the water, as though something below were pulling the surface downward. The sapphire water, which had been impossibly still since their arrival, began to rotate slowly at first, then faster, the rotation pulling the water inward toward the center of the hole in a vortex that grew wider and deeper by the second. "Move!" Roy shouted from the boat. He was at the wheel, engine screaming, the bow aimed directly at the cluster of divers bobbing on the surface. Denise was at the stern, a rescue hook in her hand, her face a mask of controlled terror. The vortex was accelerating. The water in the center of the blue hole was descending, not draining, but being pulled actively by the creature below. It was the same technique it had used in the cavern: seal the exit, generate current, pull the prey inward. But here at the surface, the effect was more dramatic. The water was spinning, and the spin was drawing the divers toward the center of the hole, toward the throat, toward the dark. Robin felt the current grab her. It was gentle at first, a tug, a suggestion, and then it was not gentle. It was a hand made of water, reaching up from the deep, closing around her legs, her waist, her chest, pulling her toward the center of the blue hole with a force that made her feel like she was being drawn into a jet engine. She held Janelle tighter. Janelle was still not breathing. Her body was limp, her head lolling, and Robin could see the marks on her leg, red circles, perfect, the diameter of the suction cups, already bruising into a dark purple. "Gary," Robin screamed, "grab the line." The boat was coming. Roy had angled it perfectly, the bow cutting through the vortex, the engine fighting the current, the hull slapping the spinning water. Denise threw the rescue line. It landed 3 meters from Robin, and she lunged for it, one-handed, her dislocated shoulder screaming, her other arm wrapped around Janelle and caught it. "Pull!" Robin shouted. Denise pulled. The winch engaged. Robin and Janelle were dragged sideways through the spinning water, toward the boat, fighting the current that was trying to pull them down. The water around them was churning, not just spinning, but erupting, boiling, as tentacles broke the surface around the rim of the blue hole like fingers reaching up through a drain. They were everywhere. Tentacles rising from the water in a ring around the divers, each one as thick as a man's torso, each one reaching upward, feeling the air, tasting the wind. They rose 10, 15, 20 feet above the surface, impossibly tall, impossibly wrong, and then they curved inward, toward the center, toward the divers, toward the spot where the water was being pulled down into the throat. "Victor, Nadia Webb, Gary to the boat," Robin screamed. Victor was swimming. He had Nadia by the arm, hauling her through the water with a strength that seemed to come from somewhere beyond muscle. Webb was behind them, kicking hard, his face a mask of controlled terror. Gary was last, not because he was slow, but because he was looking down, into the water, into the vortex, into the face of the thing that was rising below them. "Gary," Robin screamed. "Gary now." Gary looked up. His eyes, behind his mask, were not terrified. They were full of something worse than terror. They were full of recognition. He had spent 11 years looking for this creature. He had found it, and it was everything he had dreamed and worse. "Gary!" He swam. The boat met them, the hull grinding against the vortex, the engine screaming, and Victor grabbed the dive platform at the stern and hauled himself out of the water. Nadia followed. Webb followed. Gary followed. Robin, with Janelle, was last. As Robin pulled herself onto the dive platform, she looked back at the blue hole. The vortex was widening. The water was spinning faster, descending deeper, and at the very center where the water was darkest and deepest, something was rising. Not a tentacle, not an arm, a head. Massive, armored, the size of a car, with eyes that were not the eyes of an octopus or a squid, but the eyes of something older, something that had evolved in a world without light and had never needed to see because it had always known where its prey was. The head broke the surface. Water poured off it in sheets. It was dark, mottled brown and gray, the same color as the tentacles, and it was covered in the same bacterial film that coated the walls of the cavern, the same white, translucent slime that had pulsed with respiration. Its eyes, two of them, set wide apart on the sides of its head, were the color of milk. White. Blind. The vestigial eyes of a creature that had spent so long in the dark that it had evolved past the need for sight. And its mouth was open. It was circular, a ring of serrated, chitinous teeth, the kind that could grind limestone, the kind that could crush fiberglass, the kind that could sever a human hand with the precision of a surgical instrument. And it was rising out of the water, the throat of the blue hole incarnate, the living embodiment of everything that Gary had spent his life trying to prove. "Geo," Robin screamed. "Roy, Geo now." Roy went. The coral penitent lurched away from the blue hole, the engine screaming, the hull barely clearing the edge of the vortex. Behind them, the creature's head rose higher 5 feet, 10 feet, 15 feet above the surface, and then it stopped. It hung there, suspended on a column of tentacles, its blind white eyes sweeping the air, its mouth opening and closing with a sound like a stone crusher. It did not pursue. It watched them go, and then slowly, with a grace that was more horrifying than any violence, it descended. The head sank below the surface. The tentacles withdrew. The vortex slowed and then stopped. The water of the blue hole returned to its impossible stillness, sapphire, perfect, waiting. From the stern of the retreating boat, Robin watched the blue hole grow smaller. Her shoulder was dislocated. Janelle was not breathing. Tamaz was dead. And the creature, the thing that Gary had called the Lusca, the thing that the locals called him of the hairy hands, was sinking back into its throat, back into the dark, back into the perfect silence of a world that had never needed the sun. It would wait. It had waited for millennia. It could wait a little longer. But Robin knew, with a certainty that settled into her bones like the cold of the water, that it would not wait for long. The coral penitent made the creek mouth in 40 minutes. Roy pushed the engine to redline and held it there, the hull shuddering with the strain, the propeller churning the shallow water into a wake that sent bonefish scattering like sparks. Denise was in the cockpit with Janelle, performing CPR, chest compressions, rescue breaths, the mechanical rhythm of a person trying to force life back into a body that had decided to leave. The compressions were not working. Janelle's lips were blue. Her chest was still. The monitor that Denise had clipped to her finger read 0. Robin sat on the dive platform with her back against the transom, cradling her dislocated shoulder, and watched the mangrove slide past. She was shaking, not from the cold, though the cold was real and deep, but from the adrenaline crash that comes after the body has been running on survival chemistry for too long and the supply runs out. Her hands were trembling, her teeth were chattering, and behind her eyes, replaying on a loop that she could not stop, was the image of Tamaz's hand, 2 fingers, a palm, a severed wrist, the bone white at the cross-section floating in the beam of her light. Victor sat beside her. He had not spoken since they'd surfaced. His knife, the short, serrated blade that he had driven into the tentacle, was still in his hand, and the blade was black with the creature's fluid. He stared at the fluid the way a man stares at a crossword puzzle, as though the answer were written in the color and he just needed to decipher it. Nadia was in the cabin, hunched over her slate, sketching the cavern from memory with a speed and precision that belied her state. She was a scientist, and scientists process trauma through work. Her drawings were meticulous, the shape of the cavern, the position of the boat, the trajectory of the tentacles, and she was annotating them with notes in a cramped, tight handwriting. Suction cup diameter, 12-15 cm. Tentacle diameter at base, est, 60 cm. Number of visible appendages, 6+. Fluid, dark, viscous, non-hemolytic. Behavior, encircling, not pursuing. Strategy, bottleneck containment. Webb was at the bow, alone, staring at the water. He had not spoken since the surface. His hands were resting on the railing, and Robin could see them from behind, white-knuckled, gripping the aluminum, the hands of a man who is holding onto something not because it gives him strength, but because he is afraid that if he lets go, he will fall. Gary was in the cabin, sitting on the floor, his back against the bulkhead, his eyes closed. He was not sleeping. Robin could tell his breathing was too shallow, too controlled. He was replaying. He was in the blue hole in his mind, swimming through the cavern, cataloging every detail, every texture, every sound. And on his face, the only face among them that did not show fear, was an expression that Robin recognized from her years of training. It was the expression of a man who has been validated, who has been told for 11 years that he is crazy, and who has just learned that he is the sanest person in the room. Robin wanted to hate him for it. She couldn't, because Gary had been right. The Lusca was real. The blue hole was a throat. And everything that Gary had predicted, the bottleneck, the lure, the tentacles, the feeding, had happened exactly as he said it would. The problem was that Gary had predicted one more thing. Something he had told Robin on the bow of the coral penitent on the way out, whispered over the wind, his pale seawater eyes fixed on the horizon. It's not done, Robin, it's never done. The Lusca doesn't forget, it marks, it remembers, and it waits. Robin had asked, what does it mark? Gary had said, the survivors, it lets some go. Not out of mercy, the Lusca doesn't have mercy. It lets them go because they carry the story. They tell other people, and other people come, and the Lusca feeds again. Robin had said, that's the most monstrous thing I've ever heard. Gary had said, yes, it is. Janelle died at 1423. Denise called it check the carotid, check the pupils, check the rhythm on the portable EKG that they kept in the medical kit. Asystole, flatline. The suction wounds on her leg had not been the cause of death, the cause was drowning. The tentacle had pulled her below her decompression stop, and she had aspirated water when her regulator was torn from her mouth. She had drowned inside the blue hole, in the dark, in the grip of something that had been alive longer than the Roman Empire. They wrapped her in a tarp and laid her on the deck. Webb came back from the bow and stood over the tarp for a long time, his face unreadable, and then went into the cabin and closed the door. Nobody followed him. Nobody needed to. They all understood. Webb had funded the expedition. Webb had overruled the safety diver, and Webb had brought a photographer who was now dead. The arithmetic of responsibility was simple, and Webb was doing the math. The coral penitent reached the dock at Mars Bay at 16:45. The sun was low and golden, and the water of the creek was the color of jade, and the palm trees waved in the trade winds as though nothing had happened. As though a woman had not died 70 meters below the surface of a blue hole 3 kilometers inland. As though a creature older than civilization had not risen from the dark and shown them what lived at the bottom of the world. Robin went to the clinic in Kemps Bay, where a nurse named Beverly reset her shoulder with an efficiency that suggested she had done it many times before. Beverly asked how it happened. Robin said she'd slipped on the dive platform. Beverly looked at the suction cup bruises on Robin's legs, marks that she had not noticed until she'd changed out of her wetsuit, marks that were identical to the ones on Janelle's body, and said nothing. She wrapped the shoulder, gave Robin a prescription for ibuprofen and said, "You be careful out there, honey. The water takes what it wants." Robin drove back to the rented house in Congo Town, where the team had been staying, and found Gary on the porch, staring at the ocean. He had a glass of rum in his hand, his third, based on the bottles on the table, and his eyes had the glazed, faraway look of a man who is not seeing what is in front of him, but what is behind him, below him, in the dark. "Sit down," Gary said. Robin sat. Her shoulder throbbed. The ibuprofen had not kicked in yet. "We need to go back," Gary said. Robin stared at him. "Janelle is dead, Tamaz is dead, we almost died, and you want to go back." "We have to go back," Gary said. "Not to dive, to seal it." "Seal what?" "The blue hole, the throat, we have to seal it. If we don't, people will come. They'll hear about this, the story will get out, it always does, and they'll come. And the Lusca will feed again, and again, and again. It's been doing this for thousands of years, Robin. It's the most efficient predator on Earth. It doesn't need to chase. It doesn't need to hunt. It just waits at the bottom of a hole and lets the prey come to it. And humans, curious, brave, stupid humans, will always come to a blue hole. They can't help it. It's in our nature. And the Lusca knows that. That's what makes it perfect. Gary, you're talking about destroying a geological formation. I'm talking about sealing a mouth. With what? We don't have explosives. We don't have equipment. We don't have a team. We have 4 people and 2 of them are traumatized. We have the emergency oxygen canisters, Gary said. We have flares. We have the limestone. The geology of the throat is unstable. It's a natural constriction, a collapse point. If we can trigger a secondary collapse at the narrowest section of the throat, we can seal the passage. The creature will be trapped below. It can't get through solid rock. Robin looked at him. She looked at his pale, seawater eyes, at the rum on his breath, at the fanatical certainty that had replaced every other human quality in his face. And she thought about it. Not because she wanted to, but because she was a safety diver, and safety divers think in terms of risk and mitigation. And the risk of leaving the blue hole open was, she had to admit, not zero. "Tell me about the pressure," she said. Gary's eyes sharpened. The creature is adapted to high-pressure, low-oxygen environments. The cavern is anoxic below 50 meters. The temperature is 5 degrees. It's a deep-sea organism living in a terrestrial cave system. It can't survive in oxygenated water, that's why it stays below the halocline. And it's sensitive to pressure changes. Violent pressure changes. Explosions. Explosions, Robin repeated. Oxygen canisters. High-pressure tanks. If we puncture them rapidly, if we trigger a catastrophic release, the pressure wave alone would stun the creature. And if we do it in the right place, at the narrowest point of the throat, the structural damage to the limestone could trigger a collapse. You want to set off explosions in an underwater cave. I want to set off explosions in the throat of a creature that just killed 2 people. Robin closed her eyes. She counted to 10. She opened them. "Tell me the plan," she said. The plan was, by any reasonable standard, insane. Robin knew this. Gary knew this. Victor, when he was brought into the conversation, grunted in a way that could have meant yes, or could have meant, "I am going to kill you for suggesting this." Nadia, when she heard it, said, "You want to collapse a geological formation with scuba tanks. That's the stupidest thing I've ever heard. Let me get my calculator." She got her calculator. She ran the numbers. She consulted her sketches, her notes, her memory of the cavern's geometry. And then she said something that surprised everyone. It might work. The math, as Nadia explained it, was as follows. The throat of the blue hole was a natural constriction, a point where the limestone had collapsed inward, narrowing the passage to roughly 2 meters in diameter. The rock at this point was fractured and weakened by millions of years of water erosion. If a sufficient pressure wave were generated inside the throat, specifically at the narrowest point, where the rock was thinnest and most compromised, the shock wave could propagate through the fractures and trigger a structural failure. The ceiling of the throat would collapse, sealing the passage with tons of limestone debris. The pressure wave would be generated by the catastrophic rupture of the high-pressure oxygen canisters. Each canister was rated at 300 bar, roughly 4,400 psi. When ruptured simultaneously in a confined space, the rapid expansion of gas would create a shockwave comparable to a small explosive charge. Not a bomb exactly, more like a very angry balloon. "The problem," Nadia said, "is placement. The canisters need to be at the exact center of the narrowest section of the throat. Too high and the collapse happens above the creature. It doesn't seal the passage. Too low and the collapse happens below, the creature can still get through. We need to hit the sweet spot." "And if we miss the sweet spot?" Robin asked. "Then we've set off an explosion in an underwater cave, wasted our emergency oxygen, and made a large animal very, very angry." "Great," Robin said. So we get one shot. We get one shot, Nadia confirmed. Webb was the one who surprised Robin. He emerged from the cabin where he had been for 3 hours, not speaking, not eating, just sitting with the closed door and his guilt, and said, "I'm going." Nobody argued. Nobody could. The expression on his face was not confidence or bravado or the calculated risk assessment of an extreme tourist. It was penance. Webb had brought Janelle on the dive. He had overruled Robin. He had made the decision that killed her. And now he was going back, not because he believed in the plan or cared about the Lusca or wanted to seal the throat of a monster, but because he could not live with the alternative. "I'm going," Webb said again, and his voice was flat and empty and final, and Robin recognized it as the voice of a man who has already accepted the possibility of his own death and is proceeding anyway. "Then we all go," Victor said, his first full sentence in hours. "We go together or we don't go." Nadia looked at Robin. Robin looked at Gary. Gary looked at the ocean. "We go," Robin said. "Tomorrow, dawn. And we go with a hard abort. If anything goes wrong, anything, we surface and we don't go back." Agreed. Agreed, they said, all of them, even Gary. They did not sleep. Robin tried. She lay on the narrow bed in the rented house, her shoulder wrapped in ice, her eyes closed, and she waited for unconsciousness to take her the way it takes a normal person, gradually, gently, like a tide coming in. But unconsciousness did not come. Instead, the images came, the tentacle rising from the dark. Janelle's eyes rolled back white, Tomas's hand severed, floating. The creature's head breaking the surface, massive, blind, its mouth a ring of teeth. And the sound that was not a sound but a vibration, a hum that lived in the water and in the rock and in the bones, the sound of something alive and vast and patient. She could still hear it. She could hear it now, lying in a bed in a house on dry land 3 kilometers from the blue hole. She could hear it in the walls, in the floor, in the ticking of the ceiling fan. She got up at 3:00 a.m. and found Gary on the porch, staring at the ocean. Again, always staring at the ocean, as though the answer to everything were written in the water and he just needed to read it one more time. "I can hear it," Robin said. Gary didn't turn. "I know," he said. "I can hear it too." "What is it?" "It's the creature, the vibration, the subsonic hum. It carries through the rock, through the limestone, through the water table. It's how it communicates, how it navigates, how it marks." "Marks?" "The vibration is a signature. Each Lusca has a unique frequency. This one's frequency is, I don't know, 4 or 5 hertz, below human hearing but not below human perception. You feel it, in your teeth, in your sternum, in your gut. It's saying, I am here, I am waiting, I am hungry." Robin sat down on the porch beside him. The night was warm. The trade winds blew. The stars were bright and indifferent. "Gary," she said, "why does it let some go?" Gary took a sip of rum. "I told you, it lets them go so they carry the story." "That's not the whole answer." Gary was quiet for a long time. "No," he said, "it's not. The whole answer is worse." "Tell me." "The Lusca is a predator. Predators are efficient. They don't waste energy. They don't chase prey that is difficult to catch. They go for the easy kill, the slow, the weak, the isolated. When the Lusca lets a survivor go, it's not because it wants the story to spread. It's because the survivor is not worth catching. The survivor is too fast, too alert, too difficult. The Lusca lets them go because the next prey will be easier. The next prey will hear the story and come anyway, and they'll be ready but not ready enough. And the Lusca will take them, and it will let one go again, and again, and again. It's not a strategy, it's a harvest, and we are the crop." Robin stared at him. "That's the most depressing thing anyone has ever said to me." "I'm not trying to depress you, I'm trying to prepare you. We are going back into that hole tomorrow and we need to understand what we're dealing with. The Lusca is not a monster. It's not evil. It's not malicious. It's a predator. The most successful predator in the history of the earth. And we are going to walk into its mouth and try to seal it shut." With oxygen canisters. With oxygen canisters. And if it doesn't work? Then it eats us, Gary said. And it lets one of us go, and that person tells the story, and someone else comes back, and the cycle continues. Robin said nothing. She sat on the porch and listened to the sound, the 4 hertz hum, the vibration, the voice of the creature in the deep, and she thought about the difference between courage and recklessness, and she decided that the difference was information. Courage was going in knowing what would happen. Recklessness was going in not knowing. She knew now. They all knew now. She went back to bed. She did not sleep, but she rested and she prepared, and at dawn she geared up and walked to the boat and did not look back. The coral penitent reached the blue hole at 07:15. The morning was overcast, a low gray ceiling that smothered the light and turned the water the color of pewter. The blue hole in the gray light looked different. It was still impossibly blue, a sapphire circle set in the drab green and gray of the karst. But the blue was darker now, richer, as though the overnight cloud cover had allowed the creature below to rise closer to the surface, to drink the darkness the way it drank light. Roy anchored the boat. Denise stood on the dive platform, her face set in the mask of controlled terror that Robin had come to recognize as the expression of a person who has been told what they are about to witness and has decided to witness it anyway. Roy stayed at the wheel, engine idling, ready to run. Same protocol as yesterday, Robin said. The briefing was on the aft deck, the dive plan laminated, the team standing in a circle around her. We descend as a group. Victor leads. We go straight to the throat. No stops. No exploration. We do not enter the cavern. We place the canisters at the narrowest point of the constriction. We ignite the flares and we ascend. Total bottom time, 12 minutes. That's it. 12 minutes in, 12 minutes out, and we're on the surface before the creature knows what hit it. And if the creature knows before the 12 minutes are up? Nadia asked. Then we abort. We leave the canisters and we go up. Nobody stays to finish the job. Nobody plays hero. We go up and we try something else. There is no something else, Gary said quietly. There's always something else, Robin said, but today we try this. The canisters were 4 high-pressure oxygen tanks, each the size of a fire extinguisher, each rated at 300 bar. They were strapped together in pairs with dive weights, creating 2 bundles that could be carried by a single diver. The flares were standard emergency road flares, magnesium-based, waterproof, burning at 1,600 degrees Celsius for 60 seconds. The plan was to place the canisters in the throat, ignite the flares, and drop them into the bundles. The heat would compromise the tank walls. The pressure would do the rest. The timing is critical, Nadia said. She had a stopwatch clipped to her BC. From the moment the flares hit the tanks, we have approximately 3 to 5 seconds before catastrophic rupture. That's not a lot of time to clear the throat. Victor, how fast can you swim through the constriction? Fast enough, Victor said, which meant, I don't know, but I will not fail. Then we go, Robin said, gear up. They geared up in silence. The only sounds were the clink of tank valves, the hiss of pressure checks, the zip of wetsuit zippers. Robin checked her equipment 3 times. She checked her gauge. She checked her partner. She checked the knife on her leg, a larger one today, a 7-inch titanium blade that Victor had lent her, the kind of knife designed for cutting through fishing nets and, if necessary, flesh. She looked at the blue hole. It stared back, sapphire still, waiting. Let's go, she said. The descent was faster this time. No sightseeing. No sonar checks. No photographs. They dropped down the primary line like stones, their fins driving them downward through the spectrum of blue, cerulean, cobalt, sapphire, indigo, and through the cold, 28, 18, 14, 9, and through the dark, until they reached the throat at 30 meters and the world narrowed to a tunnel of limestone and bacterial film. Victor went first, carrying 1 bundle of canisters. Nadia followed, carrying the flares. Robin was third, carrying the 2nd bundle. Gary was behind her. Webb was behind Gary. The throat was the same, 2 meters wide, 4 meters long, slick with bacterial mat. The white film pulsed on the walls, in, out, and Robin realized, with a cold clarity that cut through her adrenaline, that the pulsing was faster today. The creature was awake. It knew they were coming. "Victor, status," Robin said into the comms. "Throat is clear," Victor's voice came back. "Entering now." Victor went through. Robin watched his light disappear into the constriction, and then she followed, pulling herself through the narrow passage with the canister bundle clutched to her chest. The rock scraped against her tanks. The bacterial film smeared against her mask. The cold was sharper today, 7 degrees, 2 degrees colder than yesterday, and she could feel the vibration in the walls, the 4 hertz hum that Gary had described, the voice of the creature saying, "I am here, I am waiting, I am hungry." She emerged from the throat into the cavern. The darkness below was absolute, but it was not empty. Robin could feel it, the displacement, the pressure, the sense of something vast and alive hovering just below the range of her light. The creature was down there. It had risen. It was closer to the throat than yesterday. "Victor, where are you?" "Below you, 2 meters. I am placing the first bundle." Robin looked down. Victor's light was a yellow dot in the darkness, bobbing gently. He was at the narrowest point of the throat, the exact center of the constriction, where the rock was thinnest and the fractures were deepest. He was securing the canister bundle to the wall with a piece of webbing, anchoring it in place. "Hurry," Robin said. "Working." Robin descended to Victor's position. The throat here was narrower than at the entrance, barely 1.5 meters wide, the walls pressing in from both sides, the ceiling low enough to scrape her head. She could feel the creature below, not see it, not hear it, but feel it, the way you feel a storm before it breaks. The water was denser here, heavier. It pushed against her body with a pressure that was not depth-related, that was not hydrostatic, that was biological. The creature was generating a pressure field, a zone of compressed water around itself, and Robin was entering it. "First bundle placed," Victor said. "Give me the second." Robin handed down the second bundle. Victor secured it beside the first, creating a cluster of 4 high-pressure canisters at the narrowest point of the throat. Then he looked up at Robin, and his face, usually unreadable, a mask of stoic Russian competence, showed something she had never seen before: doubt. "Robin," he said, "the vibration is stronger here, much stronger. I can feel it in my chest." "I feel it too." "It is below us, very close, maybe 10 meters." Robin looked down. The darkness below the throat was not just dark, it was moving. A slow, churning motion like water in a washing machine, and in the center of the motion, visible only as a slightly darker patch against the darkness, a shadow within a shadow, something was rising. "Flares," Robin said. "Nadia, give me the flares now." Nadia handed down the flares. Robin held 2 of them, magnesium road flares, waterproof, each one burning at 1,600 degrees, and she looked at Victor, and Victor looked at her. And for a moment they were not a safety diver and a cave diver and a team of specialists executing a plan. They were 2 human beings, standing in the throat of a monster, holding fire in their hands, and deciding whether to use it. From below, a sound, not the hum, not the vibration, a scraping, a grinding, the sound of chitinous teeth against limestone. The creature was climbing. It was ascending the walls of the cavern, pulling itself up toward the throat, toward them, toward the light. "Light them," Robin said. She pulled the caps off the flares, struck them. The magnesium ignited with a hiss and a blaze of white-hot light, 1,600 degrees, bright enough to turn the underwater darkness into a harsh, blinding, clinical white. The walls of the throat were illuminated in perfect detail. Every fracture, every fossil, every trace of bacterial film, every crack and crevice and weakness in the limestone. And below them, in the light of the flares, the creature. It was not a giant squid. It was not an octopus. It was not a kraken. It was something else, something that had no name in any taxonomy, something that had evolved in isolation, in the dark, in the anoxic depths of a limestone vault, for longer than the human species had existed. Its body was massive. Robin's mind, even in the moment, tried to calculate and failed. It was simply too large to comprehend. A wall of living tissue filling the cavern below them, anchored to the floor and the walls by tentacles that were not arms but columns, structural supports, the pillars of a living cathedral. Its head, the head she had seen break the surface, was armored, mottled, blind, its white eyes reflecting the flare light with a sickly, milky glow. Its mouth was open. The ring of teeth, each one the length of a hand, was grinding against the limestone walls, and the creature was pulling itself upward, toward the throat, toward the source of the light. "Drop them," Victor shouted. Robin dropped the flares. They fell, two streaks of white fire, tumbling through the water, and landed in the canister bundle. The magnesium flared. The tanks, already under 300 bar of pressure, were bathed in 1,600-degree heat. The aluminum walls began to glow. "Geo!" Robin screamed. "UP now!" They scrambled. Victor went first, through the throat, his powerful legs driving him upward. Nadia followed. Robin grabbed Gary, who was staring down at the creature with the expression of a man meeting his god, and shoved him toward the constriction. Webb was already through. Robin entered the throat last. Behind her, the canisters were glowing cherry red, the aluminum weakening, the pressure inside building toward the point of catastrophic failure. 3 seconds, maybe 5. She didn't have time to count. She was halfway through the constriction when the first canister ruptured. The sound was not an explosion. It was a detonation. A concussive, instantaneous, physics-defying detonation that turned 300 bar of compressed oxygen into an expanding sphere of gas in a space smaller than a closet. The pressure wave hit Robin from behind, a wall of displaced water that picked her up and threw her through the throat passage like a bullet through a barrel. She hit the upper chamber at speed, her body tumbling, her mask flooding, her regulator torn from her mouth by the force of the water. She caught her regulator, clamped it between her teeth, cleared her mask, looked down. The throat was collapsing. The explosion, all 4 canisters going in sequence, a chain reaction that took less than a second, had shattered the limestone at the narrowest point of the constriction. The rock was falling. Great slabs of it, some the size of car doors, were breaking free from the ceiling and walls of the throat and tumbling downward into the cavern below. The passage was sealing not cleanly, not precisely, but with the brutal, chaotic efficiency of geology in a hurry. Tons of limestone, dislodged by the shockwave, were falling into the throat and plugging it with a debris field of shattered rock. And from below, from the creature, a sound. Not the hum, not the grinding. A sound that Robin felt in her soul, a sound that bypassed her ears and went directly to the oldest, most primitive part of her brain, the part that had been alive since the first fish had grown legs and crawled out of the sea. It was a scream, not a human scream. A biological scream, the sound an organism makes when it is injured and enraged and fighting against something it cannot control. The creature was in the throat. It was trying to come up, to force its body through the constriction, to reach the source of the pain, to find the things that had hurt it, and the rock was falling on it. Robin could see it through the debris, tentacles, thrashing, gripping the falling stone, trying to push it aside. The head, armored and blind, was pressing upward against the collapsing ceiling, its teeth grinding against the rock, its body contorting with a violence that sent shockwaves through the water. A tentacle burst through the debris. It shot upward through a gap in the falling stone, blindly reaching, and Robin saw it coming and kicked hard, sideways, away from the throat, and the tentacle swept through the space where she had been, its suction cups gaping, its teeth scraping against the rock. "UP," she screamed into the comms. "Everyone up, surface now." She couldn't see the others. The water was full of silt white limestone dust, churned into a blinding fog by the collapse. She couldn't see the walls. She couldn't see the surface. She could only see the tentacle thrashing in the debris below her, and the falling rock, and the darkness that was churning with the fury of a creature that had been sealed in its own throat. She ascended blind. She followed her training, slow, controlled, breathing steadily, watching her depth gauge count down. 25 meters, 20, 15, 12, 10. The silt was thinning. The water was clearing. She could see light above, pale gray, the light of an overcast sky filtered through 30 meters of ocean. At 6 meters she stopped. Decompression. She had been at depth for, she checked her computer, 14 minutes. She had a deco obligation. 3 minutes at 6 meters. 3 minutes. She could hear the creature below, still screaming, still thrashing, the rock still falling. The blue hole was consuming itself. The throat was collapsing inward, the limestone shattering and falling, and the creature was trapped in the debris, not dead, not killed, but wedged. Pinned. Its tentacles were caught in the falling stone, its head was pressed against the ceiling of the throat, and it was fighting God. It was fighting to pull itself free. Robin held at 6 meters. She counted the seconds. The water around her was shaking, not vibrating, shaking, the way a building shakes in an earthquake, and the silt was still falling, drifting downward in a slow rain of white dust that looked like snow. At the 3-minute mark she ascended. 5 meters, 3, 2, 1. She broke the surface. The coral penitent was 20 meters away. Roy had the engine running. Denise was on the platform, reaching. Robin swam, a ragged, one-armed stroke, her shoulder screaming, her body spent, and caught the rescue line and was hauled aboard. "Where are the others?" Denise shouted. Robin looked at the water. The blue hole was churning, not the smooth, sapphire stillness of before, but a boiling, violent turbulence, the surface erupting with bubbles and silt and the displaced water of a cave system collapsing in on itself. And from below, from deep below, from the sealed throat of the creature, the sound. The 4 hertz hum, amplified, distorted, transformed by the collapsing rock into something that was not a voice but was not a voice. It was a cry, a promise, a warning. "I am here, I am waiting, I am hungry." "Where are the others?" Denise screamed. A head broke the surface. Victor. He came up gasping, his face gray with silt, his eyes wild. Denise grabbed him and hauled him aboard. Another head, Nadia. She surfaced 10 meters from the boat, coughing, her regulator still in her mouth. Roy brought the boat around and Denise pulled her in. Webb, he surfaced beside the boat, silent, his face blank, and climbed aboard without assistance. Robin looked at the water, she counted. Victor, Nadia, Webb herself, 4. "Gary," she said, "where's Gary?" Nobody answered. She looked at the blue hole. The churning was slowing. The silt was settling. The surface was beginning to smooth, the sapphire color returning, the impossible stillness reasserting itself. "Gary," Robin shouted. "Nothing. Gary." The water moved. A hand broke the surface, pale, trembling, reaching upward. Robin dove for it. She hit the water, swam 3 strokes, and caught the hand. It was Gary. She pulled him to the surface, and he came up gasping, coughing, his eyes wide, his mask gone, his regulator gone, breathing air for the first time in what must have been agonizing minutes. She hauled him to the boat. Denise and Victor pulled him aboard. He collapsed on the deck, coughing water, his chest heaving, and Robin knelt beside him and checked his vitals. He was alive. Battered, bleeding from a cut on his forehead, his equipment destroyed, but alive. "Gary," Robin said. "Gary, can you hear me?" He looked up at her. His pale seawater eyes were clear, and on his face, beneath the blood, beneath the silt, beneath the exhaustion, was an expression that Robin recognized. It was the expression of a man who has been to the bottom and come back, who has looked into the throat of the thing he spent his life chasing and has survived to tell about it. "It's sealed," he whispered. "I saw it, the throat is sealed, the rock fell, it's trapped." "Trapped," Robin said, "not dead." "Trapped," Gary said. "Not dead, you can't kill it. You can't kill something that's been alive since before the ice ages, but you can seal it. You can close the throat, and that's what we did. Robin looked at the blue hole. The water was still now. Sapphire. Perfect. As though nothing had ever happened beneath its surface. As though two people had not died there, and a creature older than civilization had not been buried under tons of limestone, and the throat of the world had not been closed by 4 scuba tanks and 2 road flares. She looked back at Gary. He was smiling. Not a happy smile, not a victorious smile. A tired smile. The smile of a man who has spent 11 years chasing a monster and has finally caught it, not in a cage, not in a specimen jar, but in the only way that mattered. He had closed its mouth. "It's sealed," he said again. And then, from below, from the deep, from the dark, from the sealed throat of the creature that had been alive since before the first human had stood upright and looked at the sea, a sound. Not a hum, not a vibration. A single, massive displacement of water that sent a ripple across the surface of the blue hole, a ripple that traveled outward in a perfect circle, touching the edges of the sapphire water and returning to the center like a heartbeat. Like a promise. "I am here, I am waiting." Robin closed her eyes. She breathed. She held her dislocated shoulder and felt the ibuprofen finally kicking in, and she sat on the deck of the coral penitent and let the sun warm her face and tried not to think about the fact that the Lusca was still alive, still conscious, still waiting at the bottom of the blue hole, its tentacles pinned by fallen rock, its mouth grinding against limestone, its blind white eyes staring upward through the debris at the world that had sealed it in. It would take years, maybe decades. The rock would hold, but rock erodes, water finds a way, and the Lusca, patient, ancient, eternal, had nothing but time. Gary sat up. He looked at the blue hole, and in his eyes, those pale, seawater eyes that had been searching for the Lusca for 11 years, Robin saw something that made her colder than the water had ever been. She saw longing. She saw the expression of a man who has found the thing he loves most in the world and has been forced to lock it away. "It's sealed," he said for the 3rd time. And this time his voice was not triumphant. It was grieving. He was mourning. The monster was trapped, and the man who had spent his life chasing it was grieving. Robin looked away. She looked at the ocean. She looked at the sky. She looked at anything that was not the blue hole, anything that was not sapphire, anything that was not the color of the thing that lived below. And from the water one last sound. Not the hum, not the heartbeat. A tentacle. A single, massive, suction cup tentacle breaching the surface of the blue hole for a split second, not to attack, not to reach, not to feed, but to touch the air, to feel the sun, to remind the world above that it was still there. Then it was gone, and the blue hole was still, and the sapphire water sat in its perfect circle and waited. Recovered audio log, Fragment 2. Device registered to Gary KORDIS. The following audio was recorded on the same device as Fragment 1, approximately 2 hours after the events described above. The recording quality is poor. The voice is barely audible. "It's sealed. I watched the rock fall. I watched the tentacles get pinned. I watched the mouth close. But I can still hear it. The hum, the 4 hertz hum, it's coming through the rock, through the water table, through the limestone. It's not loud, but it's there, and it's constant, and it doesn't stop. I'm going to go back. Not today, not tomorrow, but someday. Because I can hear it, and it can hear me, and I think it's calling. Not for food, not for prey, for me. I found it, I sealed it, I trapped it in the dark. And now I can't sleep, because every time I close my eyes I see the blue, and every time I hear the hum I think it's still there, it's still waiting, it's still hungry. And so am I. God help me, so am I." End of recording, end of file, end of expedition. The blue hole remains unnamed. The land surrounding it was purchased in 2025 by a private entity registered in Nassau, Bahamas. The entity is listed as a Marine Conservation Trust. Its board of directors consists of 4 names: Robin Lim, Victor Potanin, Nadia Okonkwo, and Marcus Webb. Gary Cordes is not listed on the board. He was last seen in Nassau in October of 2025, purchasing a single tank of compressed air and a set of dive weights from a shop on Bay Street. He paid in cash. He has not been seen since. The blue hole is still sapphire. The blue hole is still. The blue hole is still waiting. And if you listen, if you press your ear to the limestone, if you put your hand on the rock, if you close your eyes and feel for the vibration that lives below the threshold of hearing, you can still hear it. 4 hertz constant, patient. I am here, I am waiting, I am hungry. The Sulfur Sleep. The burn mark on the ceiling was perfectly circular. It was the size of a 50-shilling coin, roughly 2 centimeters in diameter, and it sat directly above the bed, centered between the 2 pillows with a precision that suggested it had not been made by accident. The plaster around it was untouched. No scorched trails. No smoke damage. No evidence of fire except for the burn itself, which was dark and crisp, and had the texture of a wound that had cauterized instantly, the surface sealed by heat so intense that it had burned clean through the paint and into the raw gypsum beneath. Dr. Callum Mtet was stood on the bed in his underwear at 3:47 a.m., staring at the burn mark, and he smelled 2 things. The first was sulfur, not the sharp, volcanic sulfur of a hot spring, but the dull, stale sulfur of old eggs, the kind that has been sitting in a neglected refrigerator for weeks. It was the sulfur of decay, of something biological that had been metabolizing in a place without oxygen. The second smell was copper, wet copper, the smell of blood. He looked down at his wife, Amina. She was asleep, deeply, thoroughly asleep, the kind of sleep that looked less like rest and more like unconsciousness, the body so profoundly shut down that it had bypassed the normal stages of slumber and gone directly to something deeper. Her breathing was slow, too slow, 8 breaths per minute by Callum's count when her normal resting rate was 14. Her face was slack. Her eyes beneath the lids were not moving. No REM, no dreaming. And at the foot of the bed, between Amina's feet and the carved mahogany footboard, something was purring. It was the cat. It had to be the cat. They had a cat, a tabby named Mr. Pemba, a fat, lazy, neutered male who spent his days sleeping on the windowsill and his nights hunting geckos. Mr. Pemba purred. He purred loudly, constantly, with the mechanical enthusiasm of a small engine that had never learned to idle. The purring at the foot of the bed was exactly the kind of sound Mr. Pemba would make. Except, Callum leaned over the bed and looked at the footboard. The purring was coming from the floor, from the shadow beneath the bed, from the space between the carved mahogany legs where the moonlight from the window didn't reach. He could not see the cat. He could see only shadow, a pool of darkness that seemed deeper than it should have been, darker than the ambient light level justified, as though the shadow itself were a substance rather than an absence. And the purring was wrong, not the sound, the rhythm. Mr. Pemba purred in bursts, the way all cats did, with a natural variation in frequency that reflected the animal's autonomic state. This purring was constant, perfectly constant. A single, unmodulated frequency, like a tuning fork, like a machine, like something that had learned to mimic the sound of a cat but had not learned that the sound was supposed to vary. Callum reached for his phone on the nightstand. As he did, his hand passed over Amina's wrist, and his fingers, trained by 12 years of clinical practice, registered her pulse. It was 42 beats per minute. A normal resting heart rate for an adult woman was 60 to 100. 42 was bradycardia. 42 was the heart rate of a hibernating animal. He pressed his fingers harder into her wrist. The pulse was not just slow, it was irregular. The intervals between beats were not uniform, not the way arrhythmia is irregular with a predictable randomness, but with a pattern that was subtly, maddeningly wrong. Long, long, short. Long, long, short. Like a code. Like a signal. Like something was using his wife's heart as a metronome. Callum got off the bed. He walked to the light switch on the wall and flipped it. The overhead bulb, a 60-watt incandescent, warm white clicked on, and the room was flooded with light, and the shadow beneath the bed was just a shadow, and the purring had stopped, and Amina stirred and opened her eyes and looked at him with the drowsy confusion of a woman who has been woken at 3:47 a.m. by a husband standing on the bed in his underwear. "Callum, what's wrong?" "Did you hear the cat?" Callum said. Amina blinked. "The cat." "It was purring under the bed." "Mr. Pemba is outside," Amina said. "I put him out before we went asleep. He was scratching at the door." Callum looked at the foot of the bed. The shadow was gone. The space beneath the bed was empty, just the floor, the dust ruffle, the carved legs of the mahogany frame. No cat, no shadow, no sound. He looked at the ceiling. The burn mark was still there, perfectly circular, dark, crisp. "Amina," he said, "do you see that?" Amina looked up. She squinted. "See what?" "On the ceiling above the bed, the burn mark." Amina stared at the ceiling for a long time. "I don't see anything, Callum." Callum looked at the ceiling. The burn mark was there. It was as clear as a hole in a wall, as obvious as a stain on a white shirt. It was 2 centimeters in diameter, perfectly circular, dark against the white plaster. "You don't see a burn mark, right there, above your head?" Amina sat up. She looked at the ceiling again. She reached up and touched the plaster where Callum was pointing. Her fingers came back clean. No soot, no residue, nothing. "There's nothing there, Callum. Go to sleep." Callum stared at the burn mark. It stared back, dark, circular, patient. He did not go to sleep. He sat on the edge of the bed, his feet on the floor, his eyes on the ceiling, and he did not sleep. And the sulfur smell lingered in the curtains, and the copper smell lingered in the air, and somewhere outside, in the darkness of the coastal village of Wheat, on the northern tip of Pemba Island, Mr. Pemba the tabby cat was sitting on the windowsill of a house that was not his own, staring through the glass at a family he did not recognize, and the family inside that house was not sleeping either, because no one in Wheat was sleeping anymore. The island of Pemba is 35 miles north of Zanzibar in the Indian Ocean, 60 miles off the coast of mainland Tanzania, and 1,000 years from anywhere that matters. It is a green island, clove plantations, mangrove forests, coral rag hills that drop into turquoise water, and it is a quiet island, the kind of place where the loudest sound on any given night is the wind through the baobab trees, and the second loudest is the call to prayer from the village mosque. Wheat is the largest town on Pemba's northern coast. It has a population of approximately 9,000, a district hospital, a fish market, a dhow harbor, and a reputation, among the people of Zanzibar town, for being backward. The people of Wheat are farmers and fishermen. They are Swahili. They are Muslim. They are superstitious in the way that all rural people are superstitious, not irrationally, but practically, as a method of organizing a world that contains things the eye cannot see and the mind cannot explain. Callum Mtetwa was the only doctor at the Wheat District Hospital for 3 years. He was Tanzanian, born in Dar es Salaam, educated at the University of Nairobi, trained in internal medicine at Aga Khan Hospital, and he had come to Pemba because the pay was good and the posting was remote, and he needed to be as far as possible from his ex-wife, who had kept the apartment in Dar and the Toyota and the dog. He was 39, lean, bespectacled, and possessed of the particular brand of skepticism that makes good doctors. He did not believe in anything he could not test, measure, or palpate. He believed in bacteria. He believed in blood pressure. He believed in the WHO essential medicines list. He did not believe in jinn, in Mizimu, in Popobawa, or in any of the other supernatural entities that the people of Pemba had been talking about for centuries. He especially did not believe in the Popobawa. The Popobawa, the name meant bat wing in Swahili, was a creature from Zanzibari and Pemban folklore. It was described variously as a shapeshifter, a one-eyed giant, a bat-winged humanoid, or a jinn that could enter houses through keyholes and cracks in the wall. It was said to attack people in their sleep, to sodomize men, a detail that the colonial authorities had found both lurid and embarrassing, and to leave behind a smell of sulfur. The first major outbreak of Popobawa attacks had been reported in Zanzibar in 1971, during the political upheaval that followed the revolution. Subsequent outbreaks had occurred in 1995 and 2007, always during times of political tension, always characterized by mass hysteria, and always resolved without any physical evidence of a creature. Callum had read the literature. He had read the papers in the East African medical journal Mass Hysteria on Pemba Island, a clinical account, 1973, the Popobawa phenomenon, Sociocultural Factors in Collective Delusion, 1996, Epidemiology of Sleep-Related Panic Attacks in Coastal Tanzania, 2008. The consensus was clear. The Popobawa was a cultural-bound syndrome, a form of mass hysteria triggered by social stress and propagated through community suggestion. It was not real. It was a story that people told themselves to explain the inexplicable, and the telling made it true. Callum believed this. He believed it with the same conviction that he believed in the germ theory of disease and the importance of hand-washing. He believed it right up until the night he stood on his bed in his underwear at 3:47 a.m. and saw a burn mark on the ceiling that his wife could not see, and heard a cat purring that was not a cat. The patients began arriving in his clinic 2 weeks later. The first was a woman named Fatuma, 53, a clove farmer from the village of Mjini Ol. She came in at 8:00 a.m. on a Tuesday, walking with the stiff, careful gait of a person whose body hurts in places she doesn't understand. She sat in the plastic chair across from Callum's desk and said, in Swahili, "I can't sleep." This was not unusual. Wheat District Hospital saw a steady stream of patients with insomnia. The heat, the mosquitoes, the roosters, the 4:00 a.m. call to prayer from the mosque next door all contributed to a baseline of sleep deprivation that was, by island standards, normal. But Fatuma's insomnia was different. "When I close my eyes," she said, "I feel something in the room, not a person, a presence, like the air has become thick, like the room is breathing." Callum nodded. He had heard this before. The phrase, "the room is breathing," chumba in Apumua, was a common description in Popobawa accounts, reported in every outbreak since 1971. It was a classic manifestation of sleep paralysis, the hypnagogic hallucination that occurs when the brain transitions between sleep stages and the body's normal paralysis mechanism malfunctions, leaving the conscious mind trapped in a body that cannot move while the dream state bleeds into waking reality. "You feel this when you're falling asleep?" Callum asked. "No, I feel it when I am asleep. It wakes me up. Something in the room, something I can't see, pushes me back down, and then I can't move. I can't speak. I can only lie there and listen to it breathe." "Does it speak?" Fatuma looked at her hands. "It speaks in my husband's voice." Callum paused. This was new. In the literature, the Popobawa did not speak in the voices of known individuals. It was described as making animal sounds, grunts, hisses, the beating of wings. Speaking in a familiar voice was a detail that Fatuma would not have known from folklore, because it was not part of the folklore. "Your husband's voice," Callum repeated. "What does it say?" "It says, 'Let me in.'" "Let you in." "Let me in," over and over, in my husband's voice. "But my husband is dead. He died in January." Callum wrote this down. He prescribed a low dose of diazepam, 2 mg, enough to break the anxiety cycle without causing dependence, and told Fatuma to come back in a week. She left, and Callum thought nothing more of it. The second patient came in that afternoon. His name was Hamisi, 26, a fisherman from Tandwa. He came in shirtless, and Callum could see the marks immediately. 4 parallel scratches on his right shoulder, deep enough to have bled, already scabbing over with the dark crust of a wound that was several days old. "What happened?" Callum asked. Hamisi looked at the floor. I was sleeping. I woke up with these. You woke up with scratches on your shoulder. Yes. Did you scratch yourself in your sleep? No, my hands were under the blanket. My wife saw them in the morning. Callum examined the scratches. They were not self-inflicted. The angle was wrong, the depth was uneven, and the spacing between the four lines was too wide for human fingernails. They looked like claw marks. Not the claw marks of a cat, too deep, too wide, but the claw marks of something larger, something with hands. Hamacy, Callum said, did you see anything? Hamacy did not look up. I didn't see it. I heard it. It was in the rafters, moving from one beam to the next, like it was counting them, like it was measuring the house. Measuring. It was measuring the house, looking for the best way in, the best place to wait. Callum prescribed a tetanus booster and an antibiotic ointment. He noted the scratches in his clinical record with the notation etiology unknown, possible parasomnia. He did not write Popobawa. He did not believe in the Popobawa. By the end of the second week, he had seen 14 patients, all from Wheat or the surrounding villages, all with the same constellation of symptoms: insomnia, sleep paralysis, the sensation of a presence in the room, and in 7 cases, physical marks, scratches, bruises. In one case, a series of small, circular burns on the patient's forearm that looked exactly like cigarette burns, but that the patient insisted had appeared during sleep. Callum diagnosed mass hysteria. He wrote in his clinical notes, cluster presentation of sleep paralysis with shared delusional content, consistent with culture-bound syndrome, Popobawa. No organic cause identified. Recommend community reassurance and treatment of individual symptoms. He wrote this on a Thursday. On Friday, the 15th patient arrived. Her name was Nima. She was 17. She was brought in by her mother, who was weeping. Nima was lying on a stretcher, and when Callum pulled back the sheet, he stopped writing in his clinical notes, and he stopped thinking about mass hysteria, and he stopped thinking about culture-bound syndromes, because Nima's eyelids were gone. Not damaged, not swollen, gone, removed. Both upper and lower eyelids, the thin, delicate folds of skin that protect the eye and regulate moisture, had been excised with a precision that Callum, in 12 years of clinical practice, had never seen outside of a surgical theater. The margins were clean. The cuts were made with a single, continuous motion, not the jagged, hesitant cuts of an amateur, but the smooth, confident incisions of someone who knew exactly where to cut and how deep to go. The eyes beneath were open. They could not close. Nima's corneas were dry, cracked, and bloodshot, the sclera a vivid, arterial red, and she was staring at the ceiling of the clinic with the fixed, unblinking gaze of someone who has been awake for longer than the human eye was designed to endure. Nima, Callum said, "Can you hear me?" She could. Her eyes moved not to look at him, because she couldn't look at anything without eyelids. The motion was too painful. But they tracked the sound of his voice, the way a person's eyes track a voice when they are in a dark room. He took them, Nima said. Her voice was a whisper, a rasp, the voice of someone whose throat was parched from crying and from the constant, involuntary exposure of her eyes to the air. Who took them? The thing, the one that comes at night. It came to my room. It sat on my chest. It held my eyes open and it cut them, the eyelids, it cut them off. And it said. Nima's voice broke. Her mother held her hand. Her eyes, dry and red and open, leaked a thin, watery fluid that was not tears. There were no tears, because the lacrimal glands had been compressed by whatever had held her eyes open, and the fluid was just the eye's desperate attempt to lubricate itself. It said, "Now you'll see me. Now you'll always see me." Callum looked at Nima's eyelids, or rather at the place where her eyelids had been. The incisions were surgical, not crude, not improvised, not the work of a terrified teenager self-mutilating in the night. They were surgical, and they were clean, and the instrument that had made them had been sharp enough to cut skin without tearing it, and the hand that had wielded it had been steady enough to follow the curve of the orbital rim without slipping. And Callum, who had assisted on dozens of ophthalmological procedures during his residency, could not have done a better job. He looked at his clinical notes. The words mass hysteria stared back at him from the page. He picked up his pen. He crossed them out. He wrote, organic, unknown etiology, refer. He did not refer. There was nowhere to refer. The nearest ophthalmologist was in Zanzibar town, a 2-hour ferry ride away, and Nima needed immediate treatment, artificial tears, antibiotic ointment, a temporary moisture shield to protect her exposed corneas. He treated her in the clinic, working by the light of a battery-powered lantern because the power had gone out. It went out often in wheat, sometimes for hours, and the darkness that followed was always deeper, always more complete than the darkness of a city blackout. Because there were no streetlights in wheat, no ambient glow from distant buildings, nothing but the moon and the stars and the small, desperate glow of kerosene lamps in the windows of houses where people were trying very, very hard not to fall asleep. After Nima, the patients came faster. In the third week of what the village had begun calling the visitation, ziyara, a word used for both religious pilgrimages and unwelcome guests, Callum saw 31 patients. 22 reported sleep paralysis with the now familiar constellation of symptoms: the presence, the breathing room, the sulfur smell. 9 had physical injuries. The injuries were escalating. A man named Juma, 41, came in with a bite mark on his right forearm. The bite was human in shape, the same dental arch, the same number of teeth, the same spacing, but the depth was wrong. The bite had gone through the skin, through the subcutaneous fat and into the muscle. A human bite can generate approximately 70 pounds of force per square inch. This bite had generated enough force to crack the radius. No human jaw, not even one suffering from tetanus or seizure, could produce that kind of pressure unconsciously during sleep. A woman named Rahema, 67, came in with her left ear missing. Not torn, not bitten, removed like Nima's eyelids with surgical precision. The cartilage had been cut cleanly, the skin edges approximated as though someone had attempted a crude reconstruction, and the wound had been cauterized, sealed by heat, the edges black and crispy, the smell of burned flesh still clinging to the wound when Callum examined it at 10:00 a.m., hours after the attack had occurred. Rahema was lucid. She sat in the plastic chair, and she described what had happened with the calm, flat affect of someone who has been so thoroughly traumatized that their emotional response has been bypassed entirely. It came through the thatch, she said. Not through the door, not through the window, through the thatch. It made a hole the size of my fist and it came through and it sat on the roof beam above my bed and it watched me. I couldn't move. I couldn't scream. I could only lie there and watch it watch me. What did it look like? Rahema looked at Callum with her one remaining ear and her calm, flat eyes. It looked like a man, but not a man. The shape was wrong. The proportions were wrong. The arms were too long. The head was too round, and it had one eye, in the center of its forehead, like a stove burner, like a ring of fire. And it was looking at me with that eye, and it was smiling, and the smile was wrong too. The smile had too many teeth. Not too many in number, the number was right, 32, but too many in size. The teeth were too large for the mouth. They didn't fit, and the smile was trying to fit them all in. Callum wrote this down. His hand was shaking. He noticed this and he stopped writing and he put the pen down and he pressed his palms flat against the desk to stop the trembling and he said, in a voice that was steadier than his hands, "What happened next?" It came down from the beam. It crawled across the ceiling, not climbing, not gripping, just moving, the way a shadow moves across a wall when the light changes. It came down the wall above my bed and it leaned over me and it whispered in my ear. What did it say? It said, "I am going to take this, and you are going to watch me take it." And then it took my ear, with its teeth. It put its mouth over my ear and it bit down, and I felt the cartilage crack, and I felt the skin tear, and I felt the blood run down my neck, and I couldn't move. I couldn't scream. I could only lie there and watch it chew. And it chewed slowly. It chewed the way a person chews when they are savoring something. And then it stopped chewing, and it looked at me with its one eye, and it smiled, and the smile was red, and it said, "I will come back tomorrow. I will take the other one." Rahima paused. She looked at Callum. "I have not slept in 3 days," she said. "I will not sleep tonight. I will not sleep ever again. Because if I sleep, it will come back, and it will take the other ear, and then it will take my nose, and then it will take my eyes, and it will take them one at a time, and it will make me watch." Callum treated Rahima's wound. He prescribed antibiotics. He gave her a sleeping pill. She refused it. "Please," she said, "do not give me anything that makes me sleep. I would rather die of exhaustion than die of that." She left. Callum sat at his desk and stared at the wall and tried to think about mass hysteria and could not, because mass hysteria did not remove eyelids. Mass hysteria did not bite through forearm bones. Mass hysteria did not cauterize wounds with heat. Mass hysteria was a psychological phenomenon, and psychological phenomena did not leave surgical incisions. Something was happening in wheat. Something real. Something physical. Something that was not mass hysteria and was not a culture-bound syndrome and was not a shared delusion. Something was coming out of the dark and taking people apart in their sleep. And Callum, who did not believe in the Popobawa, who had read every paper and dismissed every account, who had spent 3 years on Pemba Island without encountering anything he could not explain, Callum was beginning to understand that his disbelief was not a shield. It was a blindfold. That night Callum did not sleep. Not because he feared the Popobawa, he still did not believe in it, not really, not in the part of his brain that operated on logic and evidence, but because his clinical mind could not stop processing the cases. 31 patients, 9 with physical injuries, surgical precision, cauterized wounds, a bite that generated enough force to crack a radius, a creature that moved through thatch and across ceilings and that whispered in the voices of dead husbands. He sat at the kitchen table with a mug of chai and his clinical notes spread before him, and he looked for patterns. The attacks were clustered in the northern half of Wheat, the older part of town, where the houses were traditional Swahili construction. Coral rag walls, mangrove rafters, thatched or corrugated roofs. The houses in the southern half, which were newer and built with concrete block and iron sheeting, had reported no attacks. This was consistent with a physical explanation. The older houses had more entry points, gaps in the thatch, spaces between the mangrove rafters, cracks in the coral rag, and less light and less sound insulation. An animal, a large bat, a primate, something undiscovered, could enter these houses undetected. But no animal Callum knew of could produce surgical incisions. No animal could cauterize wounds. No animal could generate a bite force sufficient to crack a radius while simultaneously being small enough to enter through a hole the size of a fist. And no animal whispered in the voices of dead husbands. At 2:30 a.m., Callum heard something in the rafters. He went very still. His hand, which had been holding the pen, stopped moving. His breathing slowed. His eyes tracked upward to the ceiling, where the mangrove rafters ran in parallel lines across the top of the kitchen, dark with age, spotted with lichen. He did not see anything. He did not hear anything exactly. What he perceived was a change, a shift in the quality of the silence, the way the silence of an empty room is different from the silence of a room that contains something breathing. The silence had weight now. It had presence. It had mass. And it had a smell. Sulfur. The same dull, stale sulfur he had smelled the night he stood on the bed and stared at the burn mark. The same sulfur that Fatuma had described, that Rahima had described, that every patient who had reported an attack had described. It was not a faint smell. It was a thick, heavy, cloying smell, the kind that filled the nostrils and coated the back of the throat and tasted of rotten eggs and wet copper and something else, something biological, something that Callum's medical training could not categorize. He stood up slowly. He turned toward the rafter that the smell seemed to be coming from, the third rafter from the left, above the stove, the one that had a crack running through it where the wood had dried and split. He looked at the rafter. He looked at the crack. He looked at the darkness inside the crack, which was deeper than it should have been, which was darker than the shadow of the rafter justified, which was, he realized with a cold, clinical certainty that bypassed his skepticism and went straight to his survival instincts, occupied. Something was in the crack. Something was looking at him through the crack. Something was breathing through the crack, and the breath smelled of sulfur, and the breathing was rhythmic and measured and calm. Callum reached for the light switch, found it, flipped it. The kitchen was flooded with light. The rafter was just a rafter. The crack was just a crack. There was nothing in it, nothing behind it, nothing above it except the ceiling and the night sky beyond. But the sulfur smell remained. It clung to the curtains. It clung to the walls. It clung to the air itself, as though something had recently been there and had left its scent behind the way a dog leaves a scent on a tree, not to mark territory but to say, I was here. I am here. I will be here. Callum stood in his kitchen, in the light, in the smell, and he felt something he had not felt since he was a child in Dar es Salaam, lying in bed during a power outage, listening to the sounds of the city and imagining things in the dark. He felt the certainty, not the suspicion, not the fear, but the certainty that he was not alone. He looked at the kitchen table. His clinical notes were spread across it. His chai was cooling. The pen was in his hand, and on the ceiling directly above the table there was a burn mark, small, circular, the size of a 50-shilling coin. It had not been there when he sat down. Callum looked at the burn mark. He looked at the rafter. He looked at the crack. He looked at the light switch. He looked at the curtains, which were moving slightly in the breeze from the open window, and he noticed for the first time that the breeze was warm, not the warm of a tropical night, the warm of exhaled breath. The curtains were moving because something was breathing on them. Callum left the kitchen. He walked to the bedroom. Amina was asleep deeply, thoroughly, with the profound unconsciousness that he had observed on the night of the burn mark. Her breathing was slow, 8 per minute. Her pulse, when he checked it, was 42. He did not wake her. He did not lie down. He sat on the edge of the bed as he had sat on the night of the first burn mark, and he watched the ceiling, and he listened to the breathing that was not Amina's, and he waited for the morning. The morning came. The sulfur smell faded. The burn mark on the kitchen ceiling remained. And Callum, who had not slept, who had not eaten, who had spent the night sitting on the edge of his bed watching the ceiling, Callum picked up his phone and called the district health office in Chake Chake. I need to report an outbreak, he said, and I need help. What kind of outbreak? The voice on the other end asked. Callum paused. He thought about the word. He thought about what it meant, an outbreak of disease, of infection, of something communicable. He thought about Fatuma and Hamisi and Nima and Bai Rahema. He thought about the burn marks and the scratches and the missing eyelids and the missing ear. He thought about the smell of sulfur and the sound of purring and the shadow in the rafter. I don't know, he said, but it's spreading. The help did not come. The district health office dispatched an epidemiologist from Zanzibar town, a young woman named Dr. Asha Hassan, who arrived by ferry 3 days later with a case of testing equipment and a skeptical expression that Callum recognized as a mirror of his own. Dr. Hassan was 31, sharp, efficient, and armed with a laptop full of diagnostic criteria. She set up a temporary clinic in the Wheat Hospital and began interviewing patients. Callum observed her process with a mixture of admiration and frustration. Admiration because she was thorough, frustration because she was doing exactly what he had done 3 weeks ago, looking for a psychological explanation for a physical phenomenon. Sleep paralysis, she said, reviewing the case files. Hypnagogic hallucinations. Shared delusional content consistent with community propagation. The physical injuries are consistent with self-harm during parasomnic episodes. People can do extraordinary things to their own bodies while in altered states of consciousness. Self-harm doesn't cauterize wounds, Callum said. Asha looked at him. What? By Rehema's ear. The wound was cauterized, sealed by heat. Show me a case of self-harm during sleep where the wound was cauterized. Asha was quiet for a moment. That's unusual, she admitted. It's impossible. She didn't do it herself. She was paralyzed. She couldn't move. She described the creature removing her ear with its teeth, and the wound is cauterized, and she has bite marks on the cartilage that match the dental arch of something that is not human. Dental arch. I measured it. The intercanine distance is 4.2 centimeters. A human intercanine distance is 3.3 to 3.6 centimeters. Whatever bit by Rehema's ear had a jaw that was 20% wider than a human jaw. Asha stared at him. You measured the bite mark. I'm a doctor, I measure things. You measured a bite mark on a woman's ear and concluded that the biter was non-human. I concluded that the biter was not a human. I did not conclude what it was. Asha closed her laptop. Callum, I've read the literature. The Popobawa phenomenon has been studied extensively. It's mass hysteria. It's real to the people who experience it, but it's not caused by an external agent. It's caused by the community's belief that the Popobawa is real, which generates shared anxiety, which triggers sleep disturbances, which produce hallucinations, which produce physical symptoms, scratches from thrashing, bruises from falling out of bed, self-inflicted injuries during dissociative states. Nima's eyelids were removed surgically, Callum said. Show me a dissociative state that produces surgical precision. Asha opened her mouth, closed it, opened it again. I can't, she said. Then maybe, Callum said, the Popobawa is real. Asha left the next day. She filed a report with the district health office attributing the outbreak to mass hysteria with secondary self-harm. The report did not mention the bite mark measurements. It did not mention the cauterized wound. It did not mention the surgical removal of Nima's eyelids. It was a clean, professional, unimpeachable document that described a psychological phenomenon and recommended community reassurance and symptom management. Callum read the report. He folded it. He put it in his desk drawer. And then he went back to work because the patients kept coming and the sulfur smell kept spreading and the dark kept bringing things that his medical training could not explain. And at night in his house, in the dark, in the space between the rafters and the thatch, something was breathing, something was measuring, something was waiting for him to close his eyes. The first death came on a Wednesday. Callum was in the clinic, suturing a fisherman's hand. The man had caught it in a winch cable, a straightforward laceration, the kind of injury that was mundane and treatable and did not involve sulfur or missing body parts. When his nurse, a quiet, competent woman named Zuwina, came into the treatment room and said, "There's a man on the phone. He says his wife is dead." Callum finished the suture. He took the phone. The man on the other end was breathing hard, and behind his breathing was a sound that Callum would learn to recognize over the coming days, the sound of a person whose world has just been removed. Not shattered, removed. As though reality itself had been pulled out from under them like a tablecloth, leaving the dishes of their life still standing, but on nothing. "My wife is dead," the man said. "She is dead and she is hollow." Callum arrived at the house 15 minutes later. It was in the old part of wheat, coral rag walls, mangrove rafters, thatched roof, on a narrow street that smelled of clove and wood smoke, and beneath those something else. Something that Callum recognized before he entered the house, because the smell had become, over the past 3 weeks, as familiar to him as the smell of his own skin. Sulfur. The house was crowded. The husband, a man named Rashid, was sitting on the step outside the front door, his head in his hands. Two neighbors were standing in the doorway, peering in, their faces set in expressions that Callum had come to recognize as the default expression of wheat. Fear overlaid with the resignation of people who have stopped expecting the world to make sense. He went inside. The house was small, one room, a kitchen, a sleeping area separated by a curtain. The curtain was open. The bed was visible, and on the bed, lying on her back with her arms at her sides and her eyes open, was a woman who had been dead for approximately 2 hours. Her name was Emwanesha. She was 34. She was or had been a healthy woman with no history of chronic illness, no medications, no prior hospital visits, and she was dead. Callum examined her. He checked for pulse, none. He checked for respiration, none. He checked the pupils fixed and dilated. He checked the skin cool but not cold. She had died recently, within the last 2 hours based on the body temperature. Then he looked at her face. Her expression was the thing that would stay with him. It was not terror. It was not pain. It was not the slack, neutral expression of someone who has died in their sleep. It was an expression that Callum had never seen in 12 years of medicine, on any face, living or dead. It was the expression of someone who has seen something so far beyond the scope of human experience that the brain, unable to process it, has simply stopped trying. The eyes were wide. The mouth was open. But the muscles of the face were not contorted, they were empty. As though the face had been wiped clean of all expression, like a chalkboard erased, leaving behind only the raw, blank vacancy of a person whose mind had been removed while the body remained. He looked at the rest of her. She was intact. No wounds, no scratches, no bruises, no missing eyelids, no missing ears, no bite marks. She was physically unmarked. But she was hollow. Callum did not know how else to describe it. The body was there, but something essential was missing. The woman on the bed was not a person. She was a container. The contents, whatever it was that made Emwanesha, were gone. The body had the weight and the temperature and the texture of a human being, but it lacked the quality that Callum, for all his medical training, could only describe as inhabitedness. It was like looking at a house where the lights have been turned off and the furniture removed and the windows left open, structurally identical to the house next door, but unmistakably empty. He looked at the ceiling above the bed. There was a burn mark, small, circular, the size of a 50-shilling coin. He looked at the rafters. They were intact. No cracks, no gaps. But the sulfur smell was so strong in the room that his eyes watered, and when he ran his finger along the rafter above the bed, it came back coated in a thin, clear residue that was not water and not condensation. It was viscous. It was warm, and it smelled beneath the sulfur of copper. "What happened?" Callum asked Rashid. Rashid did not look up. She was sleeping. We were both sleeping. I woke up I don't know what time and the room smelled wrong, like eggs. And I looked at her and she was lying on her back with her eyes open and I thought she was awake, so I said her name. She didn't answer. I said it again. She didn't answer. I touched her face. She was cold. And then I saw. He stopped. "You saw what?" "I saw something leave. Not through the door, not through the window, through the wall. It went through the wall like the wall wasn't there. It was a shadow, a big shadow, the shape of a man but not a man, too tall, too wide in the shoulders, and it had wings. It went through the wall and it was gone, and the room was just a room, and my wife was dead." Callum wrote this down. He did not believe it. He did not disbelieve it. He simply recorded it, the way he recorded everything, because the data was all he had, and the data was telling him something that his training could not accommodate. He completed the death certificate. Cause of death, cardiac arrest of undetermined etiology. He wrote it in the blank where the cause should have been specified, and he handed it to Rashid, and Rashid looked at it and said, "You don't know what killed her." "No," Callum said. "Nobody knows." "No." "Then what good is this?" Rashid said, holding up the death certificate. What good is any of this? You're a doctor. You're supposed to know. You're supposed to tell us what's happening. And instead you write undetermined and you go home and you sleep in your bed while the rest of us lie awake because we're afraid that tonight is the night it comes for us. And we're right to be afraid. Because it took my wife and she was right next to me. She was right there, and I didn't hear it. I didn't see it. I didn't feel it. And now she's dead and she's empty and you don't know why. Rashid began to weep. He wept the way men weep when the weeping is involuntary, hard, heaving sobs that shook his whole body. Callum stood on the step beside him and said nothing because there was nothing to say. He was a doctor. He was supposed to know, and he didn't. The second death came 2 days later. The third the day after that. By the end of the fourth week there were 7 dead, all women, all in the old part of Wheat. All found in the morning lying on their backs, eyes open, faces wiped clean of expression, bodies physically unmarked. All in rooms that smelled of sulfur, all with burn marks on the ceiling. The village panicked. It was not the panic of a crowd, not screaming, not running, not the chaos of a disaster movie. It was the quiet, desperate panic of a community that has exhausted its options. The people of Wheat had been enduring the visitation for a month. They had endured the insomnia, the paralysis, the scratches and bites and burns. They had endured the loss of eyelids and ears, but the deaths were different. The deaths were the line between endurance and collapse, and the village crossed it. The mosque became the center of resistance. The imam, a gentle, educated man named Sheikh Abdallah, opened the mosque 24 hours a day and invited the entire village to sleep there together in the open under the lights, surrounded by the sound of prayer. The idea was simple. The Popobawa attacked people in their beds in the dark in isolation. In the mosque there was light, there was community, and there was the recitation of the Quran which, the sheikh assured them, no jinn could withstand. The mosque filled. Mats were laid across the floor. Kerosene lamps were lit. The Quran was recited continuously in shifts by men who took turns so that the sound of the holy text would never stop. Children slept against their mothers. Old men slept against the walls. The younger men stayed awake, sitting in the courtyard, watching the perimeter of the mosque as though the darkness beyond the lamps were a living thing. For 2 nights it worked. No attacks, no sulfur, no burn marks. The village began to breathe again. Sheikh Abdallah declared it a victory of faith. The people of Wheat were protected by the power of prayer and the strength of community. On the third night, a man named Seti, 28, got up from his mat in the mosque and walked out into the dark. His wife, who was sleeping beside him, did not see him leave. The men in the courtyard did not see him. They were watching the perimeter, but Seti had walked out through the back, through the ablution area, through the gate that led to the alley behind the mosque. They found him in the morning. He was in the alley, sitting against the wall, his legs splayed out in front of him, his hands in his lap. His eyes were open. His face was blank. He was dead. And on the wall above him, the coral rag wall of the alley, rough and white, there was a burn mark. Small, circular, the size of a 50-shilling coin. The mosque emptied. The people of Wheat decided, collectively and without discussion, that nowhere was safe. The mosque had not protected Seti. The lights had not protected him. The Quran had not protected him. He had walked out of the mosque, out of the light, out of the prayer, out of the community, and he had done so of his own volition, as though drawn, as though called, as though the thing in the dark had reached into the mosque and whispered his name, and he had heard it and obeyed. The village descended into what Callum could only describe as a deliberate, frantic wakefulness. People stopped sleeping entirely. Not just the people who had been attacked, everyone. Children were kept awake with candy and television, the few households that had generators. Adults stayed up on coffee, on cot, on whatever stimulants they could find. Music was played at full volume from speakers mounted on poles. The Swahili pop and taarab music of the coast blasting through the night in a desperate, aggressive wall of sound designed not to entertain, but to keep the dark at bay. The result was predictable, at least to a doctor. Sleep deprivation produces hallucinations. After 72 hours without sleep, The brain begins to manufacture its own reality, visual, auditory, tactile hallucinations that are indistinguishable to the experiencer from reality. After 96 hours, the hallucinations become systemic. After a week, the line between waking and sleeping dissolves entirely, and the person enters a state that is neither, a twilight zone of microsleep and waking dream, where the subconscious bleeds into the conscious, and the two become indistinguishable. The village of Wheat, after 2 weeks of forced wakefulness, was hallucinating. And the hallucinations were, every single one of them, of the same thing. A tall, thin, dark figure with one eye, standing in the corner of the room, smiling with too many teeth. Callum could not tell, by the end of the 5th week, which of his patients had been genuinely attacked and which had hallucinated their attacks. The physical injuries, the scratches, the bites, the burns were real, but they could have been self-inflicted during sleep-deprived dissociative states. The deaths were real, but they could have been cardiac events triggered by exhaustion and terror. The sulfur smell was real. Callum had smelled it himself, in his own house, but it could have been a product of the volcanic geology of the island, a release of hydrogen sulfide from the limestone that happened to coincide with the outbreak. Everything could be explained. Everything had an alternative. And Callum, who had spent his life in the alternative, who had built his career on the alternative, found that the alternative was no longer sufficient. The alternative did not explain the surgical precision of Nima's missing eyelids. It did not explain the bite mark measurements. It did not explain the burn marks that appeared on ceilings that he had personally inspected and found clean. It did not explain the purring that was not a cat, or the shadow in the rafter, or the smell of sulfur in his own kitchen at 2:30 a.m., or the fact that every morning when he checked the ceiling above his bed, there was one more burn mark. He counted them now. There were 5. 5 perfectly circular burn marks on the ceiling above his bed, arranged in a pattern that he had not noticed until the 5th appeared. They were in the shape of a pentagon, a 5-pointed star. And in the center of the pentagon, the center that had been empty until this morning, there was a 6th mark. Not circular, not a burn, a handprint. Small, delicate, the size of a child's hand, pressed into the plaster as though someone had pressed their hand into wet clay and left it to dry. Callum stared at the handprint. It had 5 fingers. It had a palm. It had the whorls and ridges of a fingerprint. It was human in every respect except one. It only had 4 fingers on one hand. The thumb was missing. Not cut off, absent, as though it had never been there, as though the hand that had made this print had been built with a different blueprint. Callum got a ladder. He climbed to the ceiling. He pressed his finger into the handprint. The plaster was warm, not room temperature warm, body temperature warm, 37 degrees Celsius. The handprint was warm because something had pressed its hand against the ceiling recently enough that the warmth had not faded. He climbed down. He sat on the bed. He looked at the ceiling, at the pentagon of burn marks, at the handprint with the missing thumb, and he said, out loud, to the empty room, to the sulfur smell, to the thing that was not a cat and was not a shadow and was not mass hysteria, "What do you want?" The room did not answer. The room was silent. The sulfur smell was gone. It came and went now, appearing and disappearing with a randomness that Callum had begun to track, a pattern that was not random at all but that followed a schedule he could not decipher. But the burn marks remained, and the handprint remained, and when Callum pressed his own hand against the handprint on the ceiling, fitting his fingers into the impression, matching his palm to the palm, he felt a warmth that was not thermal. It was emotional. It was the warmth of recognition, the warmth of contact, the warmth of something that had been waiting for him to touch it and was pleased that he finally had. He pulled his hand away. He climbed down the ladder. He went to the bathroom and washed his hands with soap and water and scrubbed them until the skin was red. The water smelled of sulfur. The shapeshifter revealed itself on a Tuesday. Callum was walking home from the clinic. It was evening. The The sun was setting behind the clove plantations, painting the sky in shades of amber and rose, and the air was thick with the scent of cloves and wood smoke and the sea. The street was quiet. Most people were indoors, behind locked doors, in rooms that were brightly lit and filled with the sound of music and conversation. The forced wakefulness had become a way of life. The village ran on stimulants and noise and the collective, unspoken agreement that if they stopped moving, stopped talking, stopped making noise, the dark would find them. Callum was thinking about the handprint. He had been thinking about it for 3 days, and the more he thought about it, the more it troubled him, not because of what it was, but because of what it implied. The handprint was an invitation. The burn marks were a signature. The sulfur smell was a presence. And the purring, the constant, mechanical, inhuman purring that he heard every night, coming from the foot of the bed, from the space beneath the furniture, from the cracks in the rafters, was a communication. The creature was not just visiting, it was moving in. He was halfway down the street when he saw his neighbor Baraka. Baraka was a fisherman, a big, affable man with a gap-toothed smile and a voice that could be heard across the harbor. He was standing at the end of the street, under the single functioning streetlight, and he was waving. "Callum," Baraka called, "I've been looking for you. My wife, she says the clinic was closed today. She needs her blood pressure medication." Callum stopped. Something was wrong. He could not immediately identify what was wrong, and that bothered him. His clinical training had taught him to trust the visceral sense of something is off, before the conscious mind could articulate what specifically was off. It was the diagnostic instinct. It was the thing that told a doctor, before the lab results came back, that the patient in front of them was sicker than they looked. Baraka looked like Baraka. He was wearing the same clothes, a faded green tachia cap, a white shirt, blue shorts. He had the same build, the same height, the same gap-toothed smile. He was standing under the streetlight in a posture that was relaxed and familiar. But Callum took a step closer. "Baraka, your wife came to the clinic this morning. I gave her the medication myself." Baraka's smile didn't change. "She must have forgotten, you know how she is." Callum took another step. He was 10 feet from Baraka now, and the streetlight was above them, and the light was good, and he could see Baraka's face in detail. The gap between the teeth was on the wrong side. Callum had known Baraka for 3 years. The gap was on the left side between the lateral incisor and the canine, upper jaw. He had noticed it because it was distinctive, and because doctors notice things. The gap was a diagnostic marker, a piece of data that Callum had filed without thinking, the way he filed the color of a patient's eyes or the shape of their fingernails. The gap in Baraka's teeth was on the right side. Callum stopped walking. "Baraka," he said, "when did you get that hat?" Baraka touched his tachia cap. I've had it for years." "It's green. I've only seen you wear a white one." Baraka's smile flickered. It was a tiny thing, a micro-expression, lasting less than a second, but Callum saw it, and what he saw was not embarrassment or confusion. It was irritation. The irritation of an actor who has been given the wrong costume. "It's always been green," Baraka said. "You must be thinking of someone else." Callum looked at Baraka's eyes. They were brown. Baraka's eyes were brown. But in the streetlight there was something else, a reflection, a luminescence, a faint, amber glow that pulsed in the center of the left pupil, not a reflection of the streetlight. The streetlight was above and behind. The glow came from within. And Baraka was wearing his hat pulled low, very low. The brim of the tachia was pressed down almost to his eyebrows, casting a shadow over the upper half of his face. It was the hat of a man trying to hide something above his eyes. Callum took a step back. "I'll bring the medication to your house," he said, "in the morning." "Why not now?" Baraka said, and his voice was right, the volume, the timbre, the accent, but the rhythm was wrong. The words came out too smoothly, too evenly spaced, like a recording played at the wrong speed. There were no pauses, no hesitations, no filler sounds. The speech was too perfect. It was a copy of speech, not speech itself. "Because the clinic is locked and I don't have the key with me," Callum said, and he took another step back, and his hand found the handle of the knife in his pocket. The surgical scalpel he had taken to carrying after the third death, not because he believed it would help, but because the weight of it in his pocket was the only thing that felt real. "Fine," Baraka said. "Tomorrow, then." And he smiled, and the smile was Baraka's smile, and the teeth were Baraka's teeth, but the gap was on the wrong side, and the eyes glowed, and the voice was too smooth, and Callum turned and walked away, and he did not look back. And he did not stop walking until he reached his house, and he locked the door, and he turned on every light, and he stood in the kitchen with his back against the wall and his hand on the scalpel, and his breath coming in short, sharp bursts that fogged his glasses and made the room swim. He had seen the Popobawa, not in a dream, not in a hallucination, not in the dark. He had seen it on the street, under a streetlight, wearing the face of his neighbor, and it had been smiling at him with teeth that didn't fit and eyes that glowed and a voice that was too perfect, and it had been playing a game of dress-up, a game of let's pretend, a game that was not about deception but about demonstration. The creature was showing Callum what it could do. It was showing him that it could be anyone, that it could wear any face, that the person standing next to him, talking to him, smiling at him, might not be a person at all. How do you verify a human? How do you prove that the person in front of you is real? Not by their face, the Popobawa could copy faces. Not by their voice, it could copy voices. Not by their clothes, their mannerisms, their memories, it could copy all of these with a fidelity that was almost perfect. Almost. The imperfections were the key. The gap on the wrong side, the hat that was the wrong color, the eyes that glowed, the voice that was too smooth. The Popobawa could copy a human, but the copy was never exact. It was always slightly off, a detail displaced, a feature mirrored, a quality slightly wrong. The way a reflection in a window is almost identical to the thing being reflected, but reversed. And there was one more thing, one more imperfection, one more way to tell. The sulfur smell. Callum noticed it now. It had been there faintly when he was talking to Baraka. Not strong, not the thick, cloying smell that filled the room after an attack, just a trace, a whisper, the olfactory equivalent of a shadow glimpsed at the edge of vision. The Popobawa smelled of sulfur always, no matter what face it wore. It could not suppress the smell, any more than a human could suppress the smell of their own sweat. The scent test. That was what Callum would call it later when he was teaching the survivors how to identify the creature. If you smell sulfur, you run. It doesn't matter who the person is, your husband, your wife, your mother, your child. If you smell sulfur, the person in front of you is not a person. It is a copy. And the copy is there for one reason, to lure you into the dark. The night of the Great Silence came 3 days later. A storm rolled in from the Indian Ocean at midday. Not a violent storm, not a cyclone, but a thick, gray, stifling system that sat over Pemba like a wet blanket and rained steadily, and without enthusiasm for hours. The rain was warm. The wind was negligible. The sky was the color of dirty cotton, and the light was flat and directionless, and everything, the trees, the houses, the streets, the people, looked as though it had been drained of color and dimension, reduced to a gray, two-dimensional backdrop against which nothing could be distinguished from anything else. The storm knocked out the power at 4:00 p.m. Not the intermittent, rolling blackouts that Wheat was accustomed to. This was a total, island-wide outage. The generator at the hospital failed. The generators at the few houses that had them sputtered and died. The streetlights went dark. The mosque, which had been running on a backup generator, went dark. By nightfall, Wheat was without power, without light, without sound. The music stopped. The television stopped. The constant, desperate wall of noise that the village had been generating for weeks, the cot-fueled, sleepless, frantic noise that was the only thing keeping the dark at bay, stopped. The silence was absolute. And in the silence, the Popobawa began. Callum was in his house. He had lit kerosene lamps, 4 of them placed in every room, the flames dancing in the still, warm air. Amina was in the kitchen, cooking rice over a charcoal jiko. The smell of the food and the kerosene and the charcoal was a comfort. It was the smell of normalcy, of dinner, of a Tuesday evening on Pemba Island, and Callum clung to it the way a drowning man clings to a rope. At 8:00 p.m., the smell of sulfur arrived. It came not gradually, but instantly, as though a door had been opened somewhere, and the sulfur had been waiting on the other side. It filled the house in seconds, overpowering the kerosene, overpowering the food, settling into the curtains and the walls and the furniture with the possessive, territorial insistence of a scent that had come to stay. "Amina," Callum said, "come here." Amina came. She was holding a wooden spoon. Her face was calm. She did not smell the sulfur. She had never been able to smell it, a fact that Callum had noted and filed and tried not to think about, because the implication was that the creature had been visiting their house for weeks and Amina had been sleeping through every visit, her pulse dropping to 42, her breathing slowing to 8 per minute, her body entering a state that was not sleep but was not sleep, a state that the creature had induced and that Amina could not resist. "Stay close to me," Callum said, "and whatever you hear, do not open the front door." "Why, what's—" The knock came. It was not a forceful knock. It was polite. 3 taps evenly spaced, the kind of knock a neighbor makes when they want to borrow sugar. Callum looked at the door. The door was locked. The door was made of solid mahogany, and beyond the door, in the dark, in the rain, in the silence, something was knocking. "Who is it?" Callum called. His voice was steady. His hand was on the scalpel in his pocket. A voice came through the door. It was Baraka's voice. "Callum, it's me. Let me in. The storm, my roof is leaking. My wife is scared." Callum did not move. He looked at Amina. He put his finger to his lips. He breathed through his nose, and the sulfur smell was thick and wet and warm, and he knew that Baraka was not Baraka, that the thing on the other side of the door was wearing Baraka's voice the way a person wears a coat, and that the coat was not perfect, and that the imperfections were there if you knew where to look. "Baraka," Callum said, "your roof was repaired last month. I saw the new thatch." A pause. The rain fell. The sulfur smell pulsed, grew stronger, as though the creature on the other side of the door had leaned closer, pressing its face against the wood. "The thatch is old," Baraka's voice said. "It leaks in the corner. Please, Callum, my wife is frightened." Callum looked at the gap under the door. It was a narrow gap, less than a centimeter, just enough for air to pass through. And through the gap he could see a shadow, not the shadow of a man standing on the step, the shadow of something crouching low to the ground, its weight on its hands, its head tilted to one side, peering under the door with an eye that was not at the level of a man's eye but at the level of a dog's. The eye was amber. It glowed. "Go away," Callum said. "You are not Baraka." The knock came again. Not polite this time, not 3 taps. One blow, heavy, resonant, the kind of blow that vibrates the frame of a solid mahogany door. The hinges groaned. The lock held. Then, a sound that Callum had never heard before, and that he would hear in his nightmares for the rest of his life. A voice, not Baraka's voice, not any human voice. A voice that sounded like several voices speaking at once, each one slightly out of sync with the others, creating a harmonic discordance that was not a word but was not a word. It was a vibration. It was a frequency. It was the sound of something that had learned to mimic human speech but had not learned to mimic human emotion, and the thing it was trying to express was not a request but a demand. "Let me in." The door did not break. The door held. But the walls, the coral rag walls, the old walls, the walls with their cracks and their gaps and their pores, the walls breathed. The sulfur smell came through the walls, not through a crack, not through a gap, through the stone itself, as though the creature outside had no need for doors or windows, as though the walls of a house were, to this creature, as permeable as a net. "Callum," Amina whispered. She had dropped the spoon. Her face was no longer calm. She was looking at the walls, and Callum could see that she could see it now, the breathing. The slow, rhythmic expansion and contraction of the coral rag, as though the walls had become organic, as though the house itself had become a lung. "Up," Callum said, "up to the roof now." He grabbed Amina's hand and pulled her toward the stairs. The house was 2 stories. The ground floor was coral rag and limestone. The upper floor was wood and corrugated iron. The roof was a corrugated iron sheet bolted to a wooden frame exposed to the sky. It was not a safe place. It was a wet place, a cold place, a place with no walls and no shelter. But it was outside. It was open. It was in the rain. They climbed the stairs. Behind them on the ground floor, the sulfur smell was becoming a sound, a low, wet, churning sound like something large and soft forcing itself through a space that was too small. The walls were giving way, not collapsing, yielding. The coral rag was softening, its pores widening, its structure loosening, and through the loosening stone something was coming. They reached the roof. Callum pushed Amina up through the hatch and climbed out after her. The rain hit them, warm, steady, gray. The sky was dark. The town was dark. The only light was the faint, amber glow on the horizon. Zanzibar town, 35 miles south, a cluster of civilization that might as well have been on another planet. And below them, through the hatch, through the house, through the coral rag and the mangrove rafters and the thatch and the wood, something was climbing. Callum could hear it. The wet, churning sound, the scrape of something on the stairs, the creak of the wooden floor, the breathing, not the room breathing, but the creature breathing, its exhalation a warm, sulphurous wind that rose through the hatch like steam from a vent. And then it was below them, just below them, on the other side of the hatch, and it was silent. Callum stood on the roof in the rain, holding Amina's hand, and he looked down at the hatch, and the hatch began to move. Slowly, upward, 1 inch, 2 inches. And through the widening gap a light appeared, not the light of a lamp, not the light of the moon, but a bioluminescent glow, amber and pulsing, that came from a single point source. An eye, one eye, in the center of a forehead. The hatch opened wider, the head came through, and Callum for the first time saw the Popobawa. It was not a man. It was not a bat. It was not a jinn. It was something that existed between categories, something that the human mind could only process by forcing it into the nearest available template: man, bat, demon, and that rebelled against the template, that spilled over the edges, that was too much and too wrong for any single frame. It was roughly humanoid, 5 feet tall, muscular, the musculature visible beneath skin that was dark, not the dark of human pigmentation but the dark of deep stone, of volcanic basalt, of something that had evolved in an environment without light. Its head was round, perfectly round like a ball, and in the center of the ball was a single eye, large, amber, lidless, that burned with a bioluminescent glow that pulsed in time with the creature's breathing. Its mouth was wide, wider than a human mouth, and it was filled with teeth that were human in number but too large in size, too wide for the jaw, crowding each other, overlapping, a mouth that was a museum of dentition. Its arms were long, disproportionately long, reaching past its knees, and its hands were large, 5-fingered, with thumbs that were too long and too jointed, bending in 2 places instead of 1. And behind it, folded against its back, were wings. Not feathered wings, not insect wings, leathery, dark, veined. The wings of a bat scaled up to human proportions. They were folded tight against the body, but they were massive, each one 6 feet from root to tip, spanning 12 feet when extended, and they were not still. They twitched. They flexed. They opened slightly and closed, opened and closed, in a rhythm that matched the pulsing of the eye and the rhythm of the breathing. The creature pulled itself through the hatch. It stood on the roof in the rain, and the rain hissed when it hit the creature's skin, the water steaming on contact, as though the body temperature of the thing was significantly higher than 37 degrees. The steam rose around it like a veil, and through the veil the single amber eye looked at Callum. It was not looking at him the way a predator looks at prey. It was not looking at him the way a hunter looks at game. It was looking at him the way a person looks at someone they know, with familiarity, with recognition, with something that, if Callum were forced to name it, he would have called affection. "Hello, Callum," the creature said. The voice was not Baraka's. It was not any single voice. It was a composite accord of voices, male and female, young and old, speaking in unison with a precision that was almost perfect, and a harmony that was almost beautiful, and a wrongness that was almost unbearable. "You can talk," Callum said. His hand was on the scalpel. Amina was behind him, gripping his shirt. "I can do many things," the creature said. "I can wear faces. I can speak in voices. I can enter houses. I can sit on chests and steal breath and take eyelids and ears and sleep." It tilted its head, the perfectly round head, the single amber eye, the mouth full of crowded teeth. "But I can also talk, and I have been wanting to talk to you for a very long time, Doctor." "Why me?" "Because you are the one who does not believe. You are the skeptic. You are the man of science. And you are the one who has been measuring my work, my bite marks, my incisions, my burn marks, with the precision of a colleague. I appreciate precision, Callum. I appreciate the way you measured the intercanine distance. That was clever. Very few of my subjects have been that attentive." Callum's mouth was dry. The rain ran down his face and into his mouth and tasted of salt. "What do you want?" The creature smiled. The smile was a nightmare, the teeth pressing against each other, the jaw straining to contain them, the lips stretching over the dental arch like a too small glove over a too large hand. "I want what every predator wants," it said. "I want to eat, but I don't eat flesh, Callum, I eat something else." "What?" "Fear." The creature stepped closer. Its foot touched the corrugated iron roof and the metal hissed. "I eat the fear of the encounter, the terror of the dark, the scream that catches in the throat, the paralysis that seizes the body when the mind understands that it is not alone. That is what I feed on. That is what sustains me. And you, all of you, this whole island have been feeding me beautifully." The creature took another step. It was 3 feet from Callum now. Its eye, the single, amber, lidless eye, was level with his, and the light from it was warm, and the warmth was wrong, and the smell of sulfur was so strong that it had become a taste, a thick, coating, coppery taste that sat on the back of the tongue and would not be swallowed. "But I'm hungry, Callum. The feeding has been good, but it is not enough. The fear of sleep, the fear of the dark, it is a snack, a taste. What I need is a feast. And a feast requires something different. A feast requires the fear of understanding, the terror of knowing, the horror of comprehension." The creature leaned forward. Its face, its eye, its mouth, its teeth was inches from Callum's face. "I want you to understand me, Callum. I want you to know what I am. And then I want you to be afraid." Callum looked into the eye. The amber light pulsed in, out, and in the light in the depths of the eye he saw something. Not a reflection, not a pupil, a landscape, a vision. A place, a dark place, a warm place, a place of stone and sulfur and deep, ancient geological time. A place where things lived that had been alive since before the first human had drawn breath. Things that fed not on flesh but on the electrical storms of the human brain, on the crackle of neurons firing in terror, on the cascade of neurotransmitters that accompanied the moment of profound, existential, species-level dread. The Popobawa was not a creature. It was a process, a geological, biological, evolutionary process, a predator that had evolved alongside humanity, that had adapted to feed on the one thing that humans produced in greater abundance than any other species: fear. Not the fear of a specific threat, not the fear of a predator or a fire or a fall, but the abstract, existential fear of the dark, of the unknown, of the thing in the corner of the room that might or might not be there. The Popobawa was the thing in the corner. It had always been the thing in the corner, and it would always be the thing in the corner because fear was eternal and the creature fed on eternity. Callum understood, and in the moment of understanding the creature's eye flared brighter, a supernova of amber light, and Callum felt the fear hit him. Not the fear of the dark, not the fear of death, not the fear of pain, the fear of comprehension, the terror of knowing what the Popobawa was, and knowing that it was real and knowing that it would never, ever stop. The creature shuddered. Its wings extended, 12 feet of dark, leathery membrane blotting out the rain, blotting out the sky, blotting out the world. Its mouth opened wide, wider, impossibly wide, the jaw dislocating, the teeth spreading apart. And from the mouth came not a sound but a breath, a warm, sulphurous, coppery exhalation that washed over Callum and Amina like a wave. And the creature fed. Callum felt it leave him, not his body, his mind. Something was being drawn out, pulled through his skull, siphoned from his brain like juice from a fruit. It was the fear. The creature was consuming his fear directly, pulling it from his neurons, drinking the neurotransmitter storm that his terror had produced. And as the fear was consumed, Callum felt himself go empty, not the emptiness of the dead, not the hollowness of the victims he had examined, but a different emptiness. A lighter one, a cleaner one, as though the fear had been a weight he had been carrying and the creature had taken it, and now he was lighter. He felt the creature's satisfaction. He felt its satiation. He felt it lean back, its eye dimming, its wings folding, its mouth closing. And he felt it speak not with sound but with the warmth of its breath, the pressure of its presence, the weight of its proximity. "Thank you, Callum, that was delicious." The creature turned. It walked to the edge of the roof, its long arms hanging at its sides, its wings folded against its back. It stepped off the edge, not jumping, not falling, but stepping as though the air were a staircase, and its wings opened and it was gone. Into the rain, into the dark, into the silence of a village that was not sleeping and would not sleep, because the thing that fed on their fear was still out there, and it was hungry, and it was patient, and it would come back. It would always come back. Callum sank to his knees on the roof. The rain fell on him. Amina held him. And the sulfur smell faded slowly like a tide going out, and the night was just a night again, and the roof was just a roof, and the village was just a village, and the world was just the world, the same world it had always been, except that now Callum knew what lived in the corners of it, and the knowledge was heavier than any fear the creature had taken, and it would sit in his chest for the rest of his life like a stone. He had understood the Popobawa, and the Popobawa had eaten his fear of it. But what the creature had not taken, what it could not take, what it did not want, was the understanding itself, the knowledge, the certainty that the thing in the dark was real. That was the mark. That was what the burn marks meant. That was what the visitation left behind. Not a scar, not a wound, not a missing body part, but a knowing. A permanent, indelible, irremovable knowing that the world was not what it seemed, that the dark was not empty, and that the thing in the corner was always, always there. Callum had been marked, and the mark would never fade. The storm lasted 3 days. For 3 days, the rain fell on Pemba Island in a steady, gray, relentless curtain, and the power stayed off, and the village of wheat sat in the dark and the wet and the silence, and the Popobawa hunted. It hunted methodically. Not randomly, not the chaotic, scattered attacks of the first weeks when the creature had been testing, probing, sampling. Now it was systematic. It moved through the village house by house, street by street, working from the northern edge of the old town southward as though it were reading a map. Each night it visited 3 or 4 houses. Each morning the dead were found. They were always the same, women mostly but not exclusively now, men too, old and young, found in their beds on their backs, eyes open, faces blank, bodies intact, rooms reeking of sulfur, burn marks on the ceilings. And the living, the ones who had been in the house but not taken, were unable to describe what had happened because they had not seen it. The creature did not let itself be seen when it killed. It came in the dark, through the walls, through the cracks, through the thatch, and it took what it wanted, the fear, the terror, the electrical storm of a human brain in the grip of existential dread, and it left behind a body that was physically whole but functionally empty. A shell, a husk, a house with no one home. Callum moved through the village like a ghost. He had not slept, truly slept, the way a person sleeps when they surrender to unconsciousness in 6 days. He existed in the twilight state of the sleep-deprived, the borderland between waking and dream, where reality took on the texture of hallucination and hallucination took on the texture of reality. He saw things at the edges of his vision, shadows that moved, shapes that flickered, figures that stood in doorways and vanished when he turned his head. He heard things in the silence, voices, whispers, the mechanical purring that followed him everywhere like a second heartbeat. He knew, with the clinical certainty of a doctor diagnosing himself, that he was experiencing sleep deprivation psychosis. He knew that the hallucinations were not real. He knew that his brain, starved of REM sleep, was manufacturing its own reality. But he also knew, because the Popobawa had told him, because the Popobawa had shown him, that the creature fed on exactly this, on the breakdown, on the dissolution of the boundary between real and unreal, on the moment when a person could no longer distinguish between what was there and what was not. The Popobawa was not causing the psychosis. The Popobawa was the psychosis. It lived in the space between sleep and waking, in the gap between reality and dream, in the crack between what the mind knew and what the mind feared. And the more sleep-deprived the village became, the wider the crack grew, and the more room the creature had to move, to hunt, to feed. Callum needed to sleep. He needed to sleep more than he needed food, more than he needed water, more than he needed anything. But every time he closed his eyes, even for a moment, even for a micro-sleep that lasted 3 seconds, he saw the eye. The single, amber, lidless eye pulsing in the dark, and the mouth full of crowded teeth, and the wings, and the smell of sulfur, and the voice that said, "Let me in the harmony of a dozen voices speaking at once." He could not sleep, so he worked. He visited the families of the dead. He examined the bodies. He measured the bite marks, the burn marks, the surgical incisions. He catalogued the evidence with the obsessive precision of a man who has decided that if he cannot sleep, he will at least be useful, and that if he cannot stop the creature, he will at least understand it. And on the 4th day of the storm, understanding arrived. It came not from the clinical data, the measurements, the observations, the case files, but from a conversation with an old woman named Bi Mwanakuri, who was 93 years old and who had survived the 1971 outbreak and the 1995 outbreak and the 2007 outbreak, and who was, as far as Callum could determine, the only person in Wheat who was not afraid. He found her sitting on her porch in the rain, wrapped in a kanga, drinking tea from a tin cup, looking out at the storm with the serene, unhurried expression of a person who has seen everything and has decided that most of it is not worth getting upset about. "You are the doctor," she said. It was not a question. "Yes. You are the one who doesn't believe." "I believed in the science. I didn't believe in me," Bi Mwanakuri said. She smiled. Her teeth were gone, lost to age, to beetle nut, to the slow erosion of a life lived fully, and her smile was a dark, warm cave in a face that was wrinkled like a map of a country that had been at war for a very long time. "You believe now," she said. "Yes." "Good, belief is the first step, but it is not the last." She sipped her tea. The rain fell on the porch around her, and she sat in the one dry spot under the eaves as though the rain knew to avoid her. "You want to stop it?" "Yes." "You can't stop it. You can't kill it. It is not alive the way you are alive. It doesn't have a body the way you have a body. It is a condition, a weather. It comes and goes like the monsoon. When the conditions are right, when the fear is high enough, when the sleep is low enough, when the crack between worlds is wide enough, it comes. And when the conditions are wrong, it goes. Back to wherever it goes when it is not here." "Where does it go?" Bi Mwanakuri looked at him. Her eyes were milky with cataracts, but behind the milk there was something sharp, a clarity that had nothing to do with vision and everything to do with seeing. "The caves," she said. "The limestone caves on the coast, below the cliff, you know the ones." Callum knew them. Every person on Pemba knew the caves, the coral rag sea caves that pockmarked the eastern cliff, the ones that the fishermen avoided because the air inside them smelled wrong and the echo inside them sounded wrong, and the things that lived in them, the bats, the insects, the unseen, moved in ways that were wrong. "The Popobawa lives in the caves?" Callum asked. "The Popobawa comes from the caves. It is not a creature. It is a presence, an emanation. Something in the caves generates it the way a generator generates electricity. The caves are the source. The creature is the output." "And if I seal the caves?" Wanakari looked at him for a long time. The rain fell. The tea cooled. The storm sat on the island like a weight. "You can try," she said. "Others have tried. The caves are deep. They go below the sea. They go below the rock. They go to places that have no name and no map. But the entrance, the main entrance, the one on the cliff, that is where the air comes from. That is where the smell comes from. If you can close the entrance, you can cut off the flow, like putting a lid on a pot." "Does it work?" "It worked in 1971. It worked in 1995. It worked in 2007. The elders sealed the cave each time. Heavy rocks, timbers, whatever they had. They sealed the entrance and the visitation stopped. The fear faded. The sleep returned. The village recovered." "Then why is it back?" Wanakari finished her tea. She set the cup on the porch. She looked at Callum with those milky, sharp eyes. "Because the sea erodes the rock. Because the tide removes the stones. Because the earth moves and the cliff crumbles and the cave reopens and the presence comes back and the cycle begins again. It always begins again. You can seal the cave, doctor. You can stop the visitation, but you cannot stop the cave. The cave is geological. The cave is permanent. And the thing inside the cave is older than the cave." She paused. "But you can buy time. And time for a human is everything. Time is sleep. Time is rest. Time is the return of normalcy, the closing of the crack, the narrowing of the space between worlds. If you seal the cave, the village will sleep again. The fear will fade. The Popobawa will retreat to wherever it goes when the entrance is closed. And the village will have years, maybe decades, of peace before the sea reopens the cave and the cycle begins again." Callum looked at the old woman. She was 93. She had survived 3 outbreaks. She had watched people die and people go mad and people claw their own faces off in the dark, and she was sitting on her porch drinking tea in the rain, and she was not afraid, because she understood something that Callum was only beginning to grasp. The Popobawa was not evil. It was not malicious. It was not a demon or a spirit or a monster. It was a natural phenomenon. A geological, biological, ecological process that operated on a timescale so vast that human lifespans were barely relevant to it. The fear it caused was not cruelty. It was metabolism. The deaths it left behind were not murder. They were waste, the byproduct of a feeding process that was as impersonal as a volcano, as inevitable as a tide, as old as the stone. "Tell me about the cave," Callum said. The cave was on the eastern cliff, 2 kilometers south of Wheat, accessible by a narrow path that wound through clove plantations and mangrove scrub to a rocky shelf where the cliff met the sea. The entrance was a fissure in the coral rag, a vertical crack, roughly 3 meters wide and 5 meters tall, that opened into a limestone chamber extending an unknown distance into the cliff. The air that came from the fissure was warm and smelled of sulfur and salt and something else, something biological, something that tasted of copper and felt, on the skin, like a breath. Callum visited the cave on the 5th day of the storm. He went alone in the rain, carrying a kerosene lantern and the surgical scalpel in his pocket, not because the scalpel would be useful against something that had no body to cut, but because the weight of it in his hand was the only thing that connected him to the world of medicine, of science, of rational measurement, and he needed that connection because the cave was not rational. The cave was a place where the rational world ended and something older, something deeper, something that predated reason by millions of years, began. He stood at the entrance. The fissure breathed. Warm air, sulfurous air, pushed outward from the cave in a steady, rhythmic exhalation, in, out, the same rhythm as the breathing he had heard in his house, the same rhythm as the purring that was not a cat, the same rhythm as the pulse of the amber eye. The cave was the source. By Mwanakari was right. Something inside the cave was generating the Popobawa the way a generator generates electricity, not mechanically, not consciously, but as a natural consequence of its existence, the way a fire generates heat. Callum held the lantern up to the fissure and looked inside. The cave was tall enough to stand in. The ceiling was roughly 4 meters above the floor, the walls smooth and wet with condensation, the floor a jumble of fallen limestone blocks and coral rubble. The passage extended straight back into the cliff for approximately 20 meters before curving to the right, out of sight. The light of the lantern reached perhaps 15 meters before the darkness swallowed it. He did not go in. He was not stupid. He was a doctor, and doctors did not walk into caves that breathed sulfur and generated monsters. But he studied the entrance. He measured the width 2.7 meters by pacing. He measured the height 4.8 meters by estimating against his own height. He examined the rock coral rag, heavily weathered, fractured in multiple places, with visible cracks running diagonally from the top of the fissure to the cliff face. The rock was unstable. The entrance was a geological weakness, a point where the cliff was slowly, over centuries, collapsing inward, widening the fissure, opening the cave. And inside the cave, generating the sulfur, generating the warmth, generating the fear, something waited. Not a creature, not an entity, a condition, a state of being, a geological biological process that had been running for longer than human civilization had existed, a subterranean ecosystem that fed on the one thing the surface world produced in infinite abundance, the electrical noise of terrified brains. Callum went back to the village. He gathered what he needed: rope, timber, sledgehammers, and a crew of men who were willing to work, not because they were brave, but because they were desperate, and desperation, in the absence of sleep and in the presence of death, was a more powerful motivator than courage. He went to the mosque first. Sheikh Abdallah was there, gaunt, exhausted, his eyes red from sleeplessness and weeping, but steady. The mosque was still functioning as a shelter, though the crowd had thinned. The dead outnumbered the living now. Of the 9,000 people in Wheat, perhaps 300 were still coming to the mosque each night. The rest had either fled south, to Chake, to anywhere that was not Wheat, or had died, or had simply stopped sleeping and stopped eating and stopped moving, sitting in their houses in the dark, waiting for the end. Sheikh Callum said, "I need help." "The cave," Sheikh Abdullah said. Callum was surprised. "You know about the cave?" "Everyone knows about the cave. The elders have known for generations. We sealed it in 1971. We sealed it in 1995. We sealed it in 2007. And each time we truly believed that it was the last time, that the sealing would hold, that the sea would not come back." He looked at Callum. "But the sea always comes back. This time I want to do it differently. Not just rocks, not just timbers. I want to collapse the entrance. Bring down the cliff face above the fissure. Seal it with geology, with tons of limestone, with a real collapse, not a pile of stones that the tide can move. The cliff is unstable. It could collapse on the workers. I know, that's why I need volunteers, not conscripts, not hired men, people who understand the risk and choose it." Sheikh Abdallah looked at Callum for a long time. The mosque was quiet. The perpetual recitation had stopped, because the men who had been reciting were too exhausted to continue. The only sound was the rain on the roof and the distant, faint, barely perceptible hum. The 4 hertz hum, the vibration, the voice of the thing in the cave, calling through the rock. "I will come," Sheikh Abdallah said. "You don't have to." "I know, that's why I will." The crew was 12 men. Sheikh Abdallah, Callum, and 10 others, fishermen, farmers, a carpenter, a retired schoolteacher, who had each, separately, independently arrived at the same conclusion, that the village was dying, that the creature could not be fought with weapons or prayer or medicine, and that the only option left was to seal the source. They assembled at the cave at dawn on the 6th day. The storm had broken overnight, the sky was clearing, the rain had stopped, and the sea was calm, the swell rolling gently against the cliff base as though nothing were wrong. The fisher breathed in the morning air, the sulfur smell rising from the cave like steam, visible in the cool, post-storm humidity. Callum had surveyed the cliff the day before. The rock above the fissure was heavily fractured coral rag that had been weathered by centuries of salt spray and wave action, weakened by the geological stress of the fissure itself. 3 key points, if struck with sufficient force, would bring down the overhang above the entrance. The collapse would deposit approximately 50 tons of limestone rubble across the fissure, sealing the entrance to a depth of several meters. It would not be permanent. Nothing was permanent, not against the sea, but it would hold for years, maybe decades, long enough for the village to recover, long enough for the fear to fade, long enough for the crack between worlds to close. The work was brutal. They used sledgehammers to widen the existing fractures, driving steel wedges into the cracks and hammering them in until the rock groaned. They worked in shifts, 3 men on the hammers, 3 men hauling rubble, 3 men rigging ropes to pull down the larger blocks. The sulfur smell was constant, thick, a miasma that clung to their skin and burned their eyes and made them cough. The breathing of the cave, the rhythmic exhalation, grew stronger as they worked, as though the thing inside could sense what they were doing, as though it were pushing back. At noon, the first crack widened. The rock above the fissure shifted, a grinding, a settling, a deep tectonic groan that Callum felt in his feet. The overhang above the entrance was loosening. 3 more strikes in the right places and it would fall. They struck once. The rock cracked twice. The overhang shifted, a block of coral rag the size of a car sliding 6 inches outward, its base crumbling. 3 times. The cave screamed. It was not a sound that came from the cave. It was a sound that came from the air itself, from the rock, from the sea, from the sky. It was the 4 hertz hum, amplified 1,000-fold, pushed through the rock and the water and the air at a volume that transcended hearing and became sensation. It was a vibration that settled into the bones and the organs and the teeth and the brain, and it was not a scream of anger. It was a scream of hunger. The thing inside the cave was starving, cut off from its food supply, sealed off from the fear that sustained it, and it was screaming the way a starving animal screams, the way a fire screams when you try to put it out. The men staggered. The sledgehammers fell. 2 men dropped to their knees, their hands over their ears, their faces contorted in pain. Sheikh Abdallah staggered backward, his lips moving in prayer, his voice inaudible beneath the vibration. Callum did not stagger. He stood at the edge of the fissure, the kerosene lantern in his hand, the scalpel in his pocket, and he looked into the cave, and the cave looked back. The amber eye, the single, burning, lidless eye, was visible in the darkness of the fissure, hovering in the dark like a sun in a void, and it was looking at him with the same familiarity, the same recognition, the same affection that he had felt on the roof. "Hello, Callum," the composite voice said from the dark, from the rock, from the air. Callum picked up the sledgehammer. He raised it. He drove it into the 3rd fracture point, the last one, the one that would bring the overhang down. The rock broke. The overhang fell. 50 tons of coral rag, limestone, and compressed shell, the geological memory of 1,000,000 years of ocean, dropped across the fissure in a cascade of stone and dust and thunder. The sound was deafening, a grinding, crunching, earth-shaking roar that echoed off the cliff and out across the water. The dust rose in a white cloud that smelled of calcium and salt, and beneath those, sulfur. The sulfur smell, trapped in the cave for millennia, was released in a burst as the entrance sealed, a final exhalation, a last breath, the dying gasp of a cave that had been breathing for longer than human memory. The amber eye in the darkness flickered, dimmed. The voice, the composite voice, the harmony of a dozen stolen tongues spoke one last time, and what it said was not a threat or a curse or a promise of revenge. It was a whisper, the same whisper that Fatima had heard, that Rehema had heard, that every victim of the visitation had heard in their dark rooms, in their beds, in the paralysis of the encounter. "Let me in." And then the rock settled, the dust cleared, the fissure was sealed, the breathing stopped. The sulfur smell faded slowly, reluctantly, like a guest who has been asked to leave and is taking their time about it, and the cave was closed, and the hum was gone, and the silence that replaced it was not the silence of absence but the silence of relief, the silence of a fever breaking, the silence of a wound closing, the silence of a village that had been holding its breath for 6 weeks and could finally exhale. Callum stood at the sealed entrance and looked at the pile of rubble that had been the fissure. 50 tons of stone. It would hold. The sea would come, the sea always came, but the sea would take years, decades, to move 50 tons of coral rag. The village had time. The village had sleep. He turned to the men. They were on the ground, some kneeling, some sitting, some lying on their backs in the rubble, looking at the clearing sky. Sheikh Abdallah was praying, his forehead pressed to the rock, his lips moving. The others were silent. They had done what they came to do. They had sealed the cave. They had closed the mouth of the thing that fed on their fear. Callum wanted to feel triumph. He wanted to feel victory. He wanted to feel the clean, uncomplicated satisfaction of a problem solved, a disease cured, a patient saved. But what he felt was something else, something heavier, something colder, something that sat in his chest like the stone that sat in the fissure. The cave was sealed. The creature was contained. But the mark, the knowing, the understanding, the permanent, indelible comprehension of what lived in the dark was still there. In his chest, in his brain, in the burn marks on his ceiling, arranged in a pentagon with a handprint in the center that had 4 fingers and no thumb. He had sealed the cave. He had not sealed himself. The village recovered. It always recovered. Within a week of the sealing, the sulfur smell faded from the houses. Within 2 weeks, people were sleeping again, tentatively at first, with lamps lit and doors locked and the sound of music playing softly through the night, but sleeping. Within a month, the mosque returned to its normal hours, the music stopped, the cot was put away, and the village of Wheat settled back into the rhythm of coastal life. The fishing, the farming, the prayer, the sleep. Callum stayed. He continued to work at the clinic. He treated the injuries, the scratches that had been self-inflicted during the sleepless weeks, the wounds that had not healed because the bodies that carried them had been too exhausted to heal. He treated the trauma, the nightmares, the anxiety, the startled responses that persisted in people who had spent 6 weeks afraid to close their eyes. He treated Nima, whose eyelids had been reconstructed by a visiting surgeon from Zanzibar town, and who now wore protective glasses and slept with a light on and would, the surgeon said, have corneal scarring for life. He treated Rehema, who had been fitted with a prosthetic ear and who told Callum on his last visit to her house that she could still hear it. Not with the missing ear, not with the prosthetic, but with the ear that remained. She could hear, faintly in the quiet of the night, the sound of breathing, the breathing of the cave. The breathing of the thing inside the cave, sealed, contained, cut off from its food supply, but not dead, not gone, still there in the dark, in the rock, in the stone, breathing the slow, rhythmic breath of something that had been alive for longer than the cliff, and that would be alive long after the cliff had crumbled into the sea. Callum treated them. And then, when the village was stable and the clinic was functioning, and the fear had faded to a memory that people spoke of in the past tense, he left. He took the ferry to Zanzibar town. He checked into a hotel, a clean, white, modern hotel on the waterfront, with air conditioning and hot water and a bed with fresh sheets and a ceiling that was, as far as he could tell, free of burn marks. He took a shower. He ate a meal, rice, fish, a mango at a restaurant on the balcony overlooking the harbor, watching the dhows come in with the evening tide. He drank a cold beer. He felt for the first time in 2 months something approaching peace. He went to his room. He turned off the light. He lay on the bed. He closed his eyes, and for the first time in 7 weeks he slept. He slept for 14 hours. He dreamed not of the Popobawa, not of sulfur, not of amber eyes and crowded teeth, but of the sea. Of the blue water around Pemba, the turquoise shallows and the indigo deeps, the dhows and the fishermen and the clove-scented wind. He dreamed of normal things, of life, of a world without fear. He woke at 10:00 a.m. The sun was streaming through the window. The room was warm and bright and clean. He stretched. He yawned. He felt in his body the first genuine relaxation he had experienced since the night he stood on his bed in his underwear and stared at a burn mark on the ceiling. He looked at the ceiling. There was a burn mark, small, circular, the size of a 50-shilling coin. Callum stared at it, his breath caught. His heart, which had been calm, which had been steady, which had been beating at a healthy 68 beats per minute, accelerated. 70, 80, 90. He sat up. He looked at the ceiling. The burn mark was there. It was real. He could see it in the daylight, dark, crisp, perfectly circular. The same burn mark he had seen on his bedroom ceiling in wheat. The same burn mark he had seen on the ceilings of every house the Popobawa had visited. The same burn mark that had appeared on kitchen ceilings and mosque walls and the coral rag wall of the alley where Seti had died. The cave was sealed. The creature was contained. The village was safe. But the mark was here, in Zanzibar town, in a clean, white hotel room, 35 miles and a ferry ride from the cave that he had sealed with 50 tons of stone. Callum stood on the bed. He touched the burn mark. It was warm, body temperature warm, 37 degrees. And beneath his fingertips he could feel the faintest vibration, the 4 hertz hum, the heartbeat of the thing in the cave, transmitted not through the rock but through the air, through the water, through the medium that connected everything on this island and every coast and every place where the sea met the land and the land met the dark. The Popobawa was sealed, but the mark was not sealed. The mark was not in the cave. The mark was in him. It had been in him since the night the creature leaned close and breathed his fear and left the knowing behind, the permanent, indelible, irremovable knowing that the dark was not empty, that the corners of the world held things, that the thing that fed on fear was real and was patient and was eternal and would be here, in the rock, in the water, in the air, in the burn marks on the ceilings of the rooms where he slept, for the rest of his life. Callum got off the bed. He packed his bag. He checked out of the hotel. He walked to the ferry terminal and bought a ticket not to Pemba, not back to the cave, but to Dar es Salaam, to the mainland, to a city of 5 million people, a city of noise and light and concrete, a city where the dark was never truly dark and the silence was never truly silent, and the thing in the corners of the world could not, he hoped, find him. He boarded the ferry. He stood on the deck as the boat pulled away from Zanzibar town, and he watched the island recede, the green hills, the clove plantations, the white buildings of Stone Town, the dark line of the mangroves on the northern coast, beyond which, 2 kilometers inland, a village called Wheat was sleeping for the first time in weeks, and below which, in a sealed cave on the eastern cliff, something ancient and patient and hungry was breathing in the dark. The ferry crossed the channel. The mainland approached. Callum stood on the deck, the wind in his face, the salt on his lips, and he felt the mark, the knowing, the weight, the stone in his chest, and he knew that it would be with him wherever he went. Not the creature was sealed, contained, cut off from its food supply, but the mark, the knowledge, the understanding that the world was not what it seemed, and that the dark held things that the light could not reach. He arrived in Dar es Salaam. He took a taxi to an apartment he had not lived in for 3 years, the one his ex-wife had kept, the one he had given up, the one that was now empty because his ex-wife had moved to Arusha, and the landlord had been unable to find a new tenant because the building was being renovated, and the construction noise was unbearable. He let himself in. The apartment was dusty, dark, the furniture sheeted, the windows shuttered. He opened the shutters. The light came in harsh, equatorial, the white light of a tropical afternoon. He opened the windows. The noise came in traffic, construction, the perpetual roar of a city of 5 million people. He stood in the living room, he breathed. The air smelled of dust and concrete and exhaust. It did not smell of sulfur, it did not smell of copper, it smelled of city, of human, of normal. He went to the bedroom. The bed was there, his old bed, the one he had shared with his ex-wife, the one that had been too soft for his back and too large for one person. The sheets were in a closet, still in their packaging, the ones he had bought on sale at ShopRite and never opened. He made the bed, he lay down, he closed his eyes. The noise of the city filled the room, the traffic, the construction, the shout of a vendor on the street, the call to prayer from a mosque 3 blocks away. It was not silence, it was not peace, but it was human, it was real, it was the sound of a world that made sense. Callum Mtetwa fell asleep. He slept for 4 hours. He did not dream. He woke at 8:00 p.m. and the apartment was dark and the city was bright outside the window, and he lay in the bed and looked at the ceiling, and the ceiling was white and clean and unmarked. He exhaled, he closed his eyes, he slept again. In the morning he woke. He made coffee. He sat at the kitchen table, the same table he had sat at with his ex-wife, eating breakfast, reading the newspaper, being a normal person in a normal world, and he drank the coffee, and it was hot and bitter and real. And then he smelled it. Faint, bare there, a whisper in the nose, a suggestion in the air, not the thick, cloying, room-filling sulfur of wheat, a trace, a ghost, a memory of a smell that lingered in the curtains, in the walls, in the fabric of the world. Sulfur. Callum set down the coffee, he stood up, he walked to the bedroom, he looked at the ceiling. There was a burn mark, small, circular, the size of a 50-shilling coin. It had not been there last night. Callum looked at it, he stood on the bed, he touched it. It was warm, body temperature warm, and beneath his fingertips barely perceptible the hum. The 4 hertz hum. The heartbeat of the thing in the cave transmitted through the rock, through the water, through the air, across 35 miles of ocean and 200 kilometers of mainland, to a ceiling above a bed in Dar es Salaam, where a man who had sealed the cave was sleeping, and the seal was holding, and the creature was contained, and the mark was not. The mark was here. The mark was with him. The mark would be with him in every room he slept in, on every ceiling he looked at for the rest of his life. Not the creature was sealed, but the knowing, the understanding, the permanent, indelible comprehension that the dark was not empty and the corners of the world held things, and the thing that fed on fear was real and was patient and was eternal. Callum sat on the bed. He looked at the burn mark. He breathed. The sulfur smell faded, it came and went now, appearing and disappearing with a rhythm that was not random, that followed a schedule he could not decipher, he was beginning to understand, the breathing of something vast and old and permanent. He was safe. The cave was sealed. The village was sleeping. The creature was contained. But the mark was on him, and the mark would not come off, and the mark meant that he would never sleep again without knowing, without feeling in the deepest part of his brain, in the part that had been alive since the first human stood upright and looked at the dark and feared it, that the thing in the cave was still breathing, still waiting, still hungry. And that the sea was eroding the rock, and the tide was moving the stones, and the cliff was crumbling, and one day, not soon, not tomorrow, not this year or this decade, but one day, the cave would reopen, and the breath would come out, and the sulfur would fill the air, and the dark would grow teeth and an eye and a smile, and the visitation would begin again. Callum Mtetwa sat on his bed in Dar es Salaam and looked at the burn mark on his ceiling and knew, with the certainty of a man who has been to the bottom and come back, that the seal would hold for now, and the creature would wait, and the world would go on, and the fear would fade, and the sleep would return, and the village would recover, and life would resume its ordinary, beautiful, fragile rhythm. But the mark was on him, and the mark was permanent, and the mark said, I was here, I am here, I will be here. And in the dark, in the sealed cave on the cliff above the sea, something breathed, slowly, patiently, eternally, the way stone breathes, the way the earth breathes, the way the dark breathes when it is full of something that has been alive since before the light was invented. The seal held. The sea waited. The burn mark glowed. Thank you for listening to today's stories. If you enjoyed, please leave a like and subscribe so you don't miss the stories yet to come.